You're Not Black Enough. A Biracial Story. The Biracial Chronicles, Book 2. Written by Jeshiem Macbeth. Narrated by Andy Robert.
"Leave me alone!"
I shouted. I was little back then. Well, skinny anyway. I've always been tall. Being tall and paper thin never intimidated anybody. To top it off, I had a bad stutter. That made life even harder for me. "You're the son of a monkey," one of the bigger Arab kids said. I was living in Bahrain with my mother and stepfather. I had never put much emphasis on race or the colour of my skin before. I mean, why would I? I was just trying to survive, with a mother who hated my guts because I looked like my father. I had bigger issues to be concerned with. But here in Bahrain, among all these Arabs, I was just a black boy. They didn't see the Arab woman whose womb I came out of. I was just an abd, slave to them. I found it strange they would call me this because many of them were darker than me and had much nappier hair than I did. Maybe it was because I was American and brown with nappy hair that they assumed I was black. Of course, their assumption was right. "Your father has sex with goats," I shot back. These Arab kids' English was not very good, and my Arabic was horrible, so understanding each other's insults was a difficult task. The bigger Arab kid looked at me with an amusingly stupid expression. I couldn't help but laugh. I figured if he couldn't understand my English, I would try and act it out for him. I put my hands on each side of my head with just my pointer fingers up to indicate horns and made a goat sound. Then I pointed at the bigger Arab kid. "Your Ummi is a goat," I said, then humped the air as dramatically as I could. "Your Baba had sex with your goat Ummi," I said as slowly as I could. I watched with amusement as the Arab kids talked among themselves, trying to figure out my game of charades. When the big idiot figured out what I called his parents, his pale face filled with rage. "Ah, Abda," the big Arab kid said. Abda meant slave in Arabic. It's what they called black American kids. It was in reference to the transatlantic slave trade that I was descended from. It was a slur. An insult to say that all I am is a slave, and all I ever will be is a slave. I'd been called racial slurs so much by these Arab kids that it no longer hurt my feelings. When I first got to Bahrain, I thought the Arab word for kids who looked like me was abda. It was later that my mother told me what it meant. The big Arab kid pushed me hard. I stumbled back but recovered quickly. The Arab kids laughed at me. I hated being laughed at. I ran forward and pushed the big Arab kid as hard as I could. He fell flat on his butt. His smaller Arab friends stopped laughing. The big Arab kid's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. I knew he was more upset that some half-black kid knocked him on his ass more than anything else. He got up quickly, his white thobe dirty with mud. I knew I was going to have to fight him, and he would probably kick my ass. But I would not back down. In Bahrain, I was just a black kid that no one wanted around. I felt like I was representing all black Americans. If I punked out, it would be a reflection on them. It would make it harder for the next black American kid that found himself in this dusty hellhole. I put up my hands like I saw boxers do on TV. I didn't know how to fight. But he didn't know that. I discovered early on that being black had its perks. Everyone expects me to know how to dance, fight, play sports, or sing. Of course, they were all stereotypes, but when it came to ignorant bullies in third world countries, it played in my favour. The Arabs saw my boxer stance and were hesitant. The bigger Arab kid did not want to chance fighting me alone. He nodded to his two friends, and they grabbed my arms. I tried to pull free, but they held me tightly. The big Arab kid punched me hard in the stomach. He kept calling me a black slave in Arabic as he punched me several more times. One of the Arab kids holding my arms pointed to some broken glass on the hard dirt road. The big Arab kid smiled wickedly and dragged me over to it. My heart started to race as I saw the glass. I thought they were going to try and kill me. I struggled harder and managed to free one of my arms. I punched the Arab kid holding my other arm as hard as I could in his face. I felt something crack as my fist landed on his nose. Blood squirted onto my face as the kid screamed. He covered his nose. Dark, red blood dripped from between his fingers. The older Arab kid grabbed me and threw me as hard as he could to the ground. My knee landed in the glass. Hot pain shot up my leg. "Stay down, black slave monkey," the big Arab kid said. His accent was so thick I could hardly make out what he was saying. I knew my knee was cut. It burned. But I did not look at it. I knew if I did, I would pass out. I hated the sight of bloody cuts, even more so the ones that show the meat beneath the skin. The Arab kid whose nose I busted grabbed a bunch of mud and rubbed it in my thick, curly hair. My mother never wanted to let me get a haircut, so I always had an afro. "Mud for mud, baby," the Arab kid said in broken English. They laughed at me and ran off. I stayed there for a moment with my knee in the glass. I was afraid to move or look at it. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I took a deep breath and tried to stand. I screamed in pain as I lifted my knee up. There were pieces of glass sticking out of it. Blood dripped from around the shards of glass. I crawled away from the glass and waited for the wave of dizziness to pass. Dirt and mud fell in my face from my hair. My mother was going to have a fit, not because I was hurt. I honestly felt like my mother enjoyed the racist bullying that I got. It seemed like my mother didn't see me when she looked at me. All she seemed to see was my black father that she hated and despised. No, she wouldn't care that I was hurt. All she would care about was having to wash the mud out of my afro. The glass protruded from my knee. It hurt too much for me to try and take it out myself. I couldn't put pressure on it. One of the few good things about living in Bahrain is that most houses had high stone walls around them. So I essentially had an endless wall to lean against as I limped home. Arab people would see me and shake their heads. They never offered to help me. Blood was dripping from my knee. I limped badly. My face was swollen, and my afro was caked in mud. I was just the son of a slave to them. Not only was I black, but I was biracial. Being a mutt here made you a social outcast. Even the few Africans I saw here treated me like shit. I guess it's the culture to make biracial people feel like they're not wanted anywhere. I wondered if that was how people like me were treated all over the world. If mixed people were treated like some leper. I wondered if that was how I would be treated in America. I was born in America. My mother married some Arab man shortly after I was born and moved here. I hated living here. Aside from the obvious racism, I just hated the people and the culture. There were many beautiful things about living in the desert among the people of the desert. My stepfather had a huge house. On top of the house was essentially another house but with no roof, if that makes sense. I would go up there and stare at the night sky. I had never seen so many bright stars in my life. Staring at the night sky here gave you no choice but to contemplate God. I wondered if that is why they are so religious here. It took me a while to get home. As soon as I reached the gates to my stepfather's huge house, I sat. I was extremely light-headed. My knee still dripped blood. I'd left a trail of blood in my wake for miles. I looked around to make sure no one was looking at me. When I could find no one, I placed my head in my hands and sobbed. I had held this in the entire time. I felt I had to be strong here. I was representing black Americans, and I had to be strong. My knee hurt so bad. I limped and bit my lip for miles to keep from screaming out in pain. I just wanted a hug from my mother. I knew that was a wish I would never get. My mother hated me. I can't remember the last time she hugged me. I would watch her hug my big sister Maya and imagine it was me she was hugging. I don't know why my mother didn't love me. Maybe she was like everyone else in this cursed desert and hated me because I was half black. I found myself often wishing to just be an Arab. Maybe then my mother would love me. Maybe then I would be accepted. Maybe I would be the one bullying a mixed kid. Life would be simpler and easier for me if I was just not mixed. Ya Allah Habibi! A familiar voice cut through my tears. I smiled when I heard the voice of my stepfather's first wife. She was always kind to me, giving me the love that my mother never did. I quickly wiped the tears from my eyes, not wanting her to see me as weak.
Salaam alaikum, Ummi Hannah,
I replied. Ummi meant mother in Arabic. I respected Hannah very much. She treated me like I was her own son. Perhaps it was because she was barren and couldn't have children of her own. I figured that was why my stepfather took my mother as a second wife. He wanted more children. Ummi Hannah rushed towards me, showering me with hugs and kisses. She looked at my knee and started shouting for the maid in Arabic, her lips pursed in disappointment. She knew I was being picked on by the Arab kids because I was half black. I was picked up and rushed inside. My stepfather had guards and his own doctor on call. I lived better than most of the kids who bullied me for being a mutt. I knew that only made them hate me more. They thought I was beneath them, that I should be poor and begging them for scraps of food. But I knew now I would be okay. Ummi Hannah would give me a bath and wash the mud from my hair. The house doctor would take care of the glass in my knee. I was still afraid of facing my mother, the woman who gave birth to me yet hated me.
Hunxie. Hey!
An elderly Chinese woman shouted. I sighed deeply. I already knew what she was going to say. This had been my life since the day I was born. This old Asian woman had been staring hard at my face since she saw me. This was the usual sign when an Asian person was trying to figure out if I was Asian or not. Being biracial in the Asian community was not easy. Asians are very cultural and traditional. My very existence was a reminder that some Asians went against those cultural traditions. Some looked at me like I was a weird science experiment. Others were disgusted by me. Most only saw the black in me. I hated going to Asian stores or joining my mother in her community. The black community was not much better as far as accepting biracial people. My father left me and my mother years ago. I still talked to him, but he had not been active in my life. His side of the family only saw the Chinese in me. They found it hilarious when someone called me Blackie Chan. They all seemed to have the exact same jokes. It was almost like they all had a hive mind when it came to colorism and racist jokes, as if they all read the same I hate biracials playbook. I swear each time a black person said that racist joke, they thought it was the funniest thing in the world. Between being sexually harassed by black men or hated on by black women, I would choose the more subtle racism of the Asian community. I was called the occasional name or avoided like I was carrying the plague. But the black community was in your face about it. They hated you like they were the black version of the KKK. I hated going to black communities. Black men stared at me like they wanted to kidnap and rape me. I felt like a piece of meat. They were overly aggressive, and when I denied them or completely ignored them, they took it personally. Their desire and lust for me dissipated, and I was now a stuck-up Chinese bitch. I guess I didn't fit in anywhere, really. I found myself alone a lot. I enjoyed my own company. There was peace in not having to answer questions about what I was mixed with.
Hey, you girl!
The elderly Chinese lady shouted again. I turned to her with the biggest fake smile I could muster. I bowed slightly to show respect to her as an elder. The elderly lady eyed me closely. Her gaze lingered for long moments on my hair. Hair for all biracials was the giveaway. Even those who could pass for one race or the other could not hide their hair. My hair was not the typical long, straight Asian hair. My hair was alive and bounced with beautiful curls. My hair was one of the things I loved most about being biracial. I could do so many things with it. I only really got to enjoy my hair when I was alone, though. My mother told me to hide my hair when I was in public, so I could look more Asian. My mother loved me, but she felt awkward seeing the clearly African in my hair and the darker tint of my skin. My lips were fuller than most Asian women's. I was taller and much curvier as well.
Are you Chinese?
The elderly lady asked. I bit my lip in frustration. I was so tired of not fitting in, so tired of having my race questioned and not being enough for anybody. As usual, I smiled and nodded. Yes, grandmother, I replied. Of course, this woman was not my grandmother. It was a form of respect to address her as such. The old woman stared at me for a long moment again, almost as if she could not believe that I was Chinese. The old woman shook her head.
Which one of your parents is Chinese?
The old woman asked. None of your business, I wanted to say. But I'd grown accustomed to holding my tongue and just smiling, being passive so as not to cause any more harm to the sensitive Chinese racial norms. I took a deep breath and calmed the rage that was bubbling up inside of me. I have to go, grandmother. Thank you for the honour of your time, I said softly. I turned from the old lady and headed for the cashier. The sooner I could pay for my stuff and be away from the Chinese and the cultural racist nonsense, the better. Not all Chinese were like this. The American-born Chinese were way more accepting, and I loved hanging with them. They were Americanized and couldn't care less for the social nonsense of China. To the American-born Chinese, I was just another Chinese American. It felt amazing to fit in somewhere. I've yet to find another half-black, half-Chinese person like myself. I've found a lot of half-black and white people. I enjoy speaking with them, but it's not the same. They mostly whine about American racism, and most have some racist complex that everything is the white man's fault. Our struggles were different. Chinese actually had a culture and valued family, something that I found greatly lacking in American people. The half-white and black biracials were no different, in my opinion. I would enjoy talking to them from time to time. It was an escape from the constant judgment of everyone else. We bonded on just being mixed race and not fitting in. We were the misfits of society, and there was some peace in that shared struggle. The old woman grabbed the back of my slender arm, interrupting my musing. She was surprisingly strong. I felt her grip tighten as I tried to pull away. I didn't want to pull away too hard and cause the old woman to fall over. I would never hear the end of it. The headline in the Chinese society would be, "Mixed race demon attacks elder." The Chinese were very protective of each other and their way of life. It would no doubt cause even more shame on my mother and maybe even violence. I stopped and turned to the old woman who glared at me.
Which one of your parents broke tradition and procreated with a black demon?
The old Chinese woman asked. Her voice never changed. She still had the voice of a sweet old Chinese lady as she said those hateful things. I looked to the cashier for help. He heard what was going on. He was Chinese as well. He was an immigrant. He was loath to get in between me and the elder. He probably figured I deserved whatever I was getting from her. "Elder, please, I have to go," I said. I gently tried to pull my arm away from her, but she squeezed harder. I winced in pain.
"You're not Chinese. You're a demon who has stolen the blood of my people. Why are you in our store, demon? Can't we have anything?"
the old Chinese woman asked. I was so tired of being judged and harassed because my parents didn't live up to the traditional and racial norms of not only the Chinese, but also the black community. I was judged everywhere I went. I could feel the rage bubbling up inside of me. I was exhausted from constantly beating it down and smiling in the face of those who hated me. I had enough. I yanked my arm forcefully, causing the old woman to stumble. "I'm no demon, old woman. This is not your country, it's mine. I was born here. If you don't like seeing mixed-race people, then take your old racist ass back to China," I raged at the old woman. Now the cashier came from behind the counter and rushed over to help the elder. "You're right, elder. I'm not Chinese. I'm not black. I'm somewhere in the middle of both. But I am tired of the abuse," I shouted. I did not realize that I was crying. All the pain of those countless years of holding this in, of smiling and nodding as they berated me for being born, as they called me a curse, a stain on the Chinese, as they cursed my mother for having the gall to love a man other than Chinese. They never once thought that maybe my mother wanted to escape the oppressive ways of Chinese men, that my mother wanted to be a wife and not the slave of her Chinese husband.
"You can't speak to a Chinese elder like that,"
the Chinese cashier chastised. I was not having any of it today. I was tired of being chastised for just existing.
So you finally grow some balls. Where were you when she assaulted me? Should I call the police and get her old Chinese ass locked up? I shouted angrily.
A crowd was starting to form. The Chinese cashier's face paled as I threatened to call the police. For that old woman had assaulted me.
The council will hear about this. You'll bring shame on your family, the cashier said calmly.
I glared at him.
The council is for Chinese immigrants. As you all have made abundantly clear, I am not Chinese, nor am I an immigrant, so fuck your council, I shouted back.
The cashier helped the elder woman to her feet. The crowd of Chinese whispered and stared at me. I could see the anger and malice in their eyes for me. I don't know why I even tried to fit into this hideous racist culture. Of course, there were many beautiful and amazing things about being Chinese, but I'd never got to experience them. My racial mix always got in the way. I was always excluded or felt so uncomfortable because of the stares and questions that I intentionally avoided big crowds of Chinese. The cashier coddled the elderly Chinese woman like she was a child. He patted her old, wrinkled hand. After he was certain that she was okay, he turned to me.
Leave my store. You're not welcome here, the cashier demanded.
He pointed at the door. I sighed and looked at him and the crowd of Chinese that had stopped to see what the commotion was. I shook my head.
I don't feel like I was ever welcomed here, I replied.
I turned and faced the small but growing throng of Chinese that had entered the store.
I'm half Chinese and half black. You all should be ashamed for your racism and for how you've treated me, I accused them all.
My voice cracked. I could not hide the emotion that bubbled up. I was so angry and so frustrated with the constant bigotry. The crowd whispered among themselves as I walked past them. The items that I was going to buy I placed on the checkout counter and left. It felt good to stand up to them. I felt empowered. I felt like I'd finally put them in their place. As good as I felt, I regretted it though. I knew my mother would suffer because of this. I knew the council would punish her in some way. My mother was trying to cling to the old Chinese traditions so she could be accepted back into her community. She hoped to find a good Chinese man to marry her. She was holding on to a dream. No Chinese man would marry her after she'd been with a black man. They felt blacks were demons. Big, dark-skinned, violent brutes. Her womb had birthed a half-demon in their eyes. She was doomed to be just as much of an outcast as I was. Benji.
You're not a real Jew, Benji. You do know that, right?
A white kid sneered. He was in his mid-teens, short and overweight. Ironically, I looked more Jewish than he did. His skin was pale, almost European, while mine was a light honey brown and my hair curled tightly.
I am a Jew. My mother is from Israel. She's more Jewish than your entire family, I shot back.
The kid's face tightened. His parents were European Jewish converts, what my mother called $5 Jews, referencing those who claimed false native ancestry just to reap benefits meant for Native Americans. There were many like them. Europeans who converted to Judaism, changed their names to something Jewish, and claimed to be the original Jews. But as my mother often said, true Jews were Middle Eastern. Some very dark, some looking exactly like me, not blonde-haired and blue-eyed.
Your father's a nigger, so that makes you a nigger. There are no black Jews. Your mother's destroyed her bloodline when she had you, he spat.
Before I could think, my fist had already connected with his long, pointed nose. He stumbled back, clutching his face, eyes blazing with rage. I'd never been a fighter. I hated fighting. But after years of being picked on by the white Jewish community, I'd had enough. Nothing I tried, ignoring, reasoning, pleading, ever stopped the bullying. The only thing that seemed to work was punching them in their smug faces.
I'm going to tell your father what you did,
he said, dabbing at his nose to check for blood.
Oh, wait, you don't have one,
he taunted. My cheeks burned. Sometimes I hated being half black. I hated having a black father. For some reason, black fathers never seem to stick around. My life would be so much easier if I were fully Israeli like my mother. His words cut deep, and I couldn't hide it. I longed for a father. I didn't even know what mine looked like. All I had was a name. Like the stereotype, my father had got my mother pregnant and then disappeared. In my eyes, he was a coward who didn't deserve my mother or me. But it still hurt to see other kids with loving fathers, a constant reminder of the empty space in my life where a father should be.
"Look, pretend Jew Benji is gonna cry," the white kid mocked.
I wanted to hit him again, harder this time. I balled my fists, fighting the urge. I knew I could destroy him, but doing so would land me in more trouble, and it would break my mother's heart. I loved my mother more than anything. The pain and disappointment I saw in her eyes the last time I got into a fight had broken my heart. I took a deep, calming breath and walked away. Even though I was a couple of miles from home, the walk would do me good.
"That's what I thought, Black Benji!"
he shouted after me. I stopped for a moment, fighting the urge to turn around and give him the beating he deserved. But I couldn't stress my mother out like that. She wanted better for me, and she deserved better. I shook my head and kept walking. I had no friends, caught in a strange place. I wasn't Jewish enough for the Jews, who saw me as just another black kid. Like everyone else, they seemed to harbour an inexplicable hatred for black people. And I wasn't black enough for the black kids, who saw me as a white boy, or an Arab pretending to be black. I never understood why anyone would pretend to be black. Didn't they realise how the world viewed black Americans? Even Africans didn't seem to like them. Pretending to be black felt like pretending to be a peasant or an uneducated bum. It made no sense. If I could choose to be anything, I'd want to be like my mother, fully Israeli. Not one of the extreme racist Israelis committing genocide in the name of Judaism, but like my mother, who loves everyone. She'd give up her home for a Palestinian family in a heartbeat. In fact, she was kicked out of Israel by extremists for protesting the genocide and expansion in Gaza. My mother was a saint in my eyes, despising the fake white Jews who had taken over her people's land and culture. I wish people could see the difference and not lump her in with a hateful Zionist regime.
"The white man is the devil. They are not the real Jews. They don't belong in Israel. Black people are the true Hebrews,"
I heard someone shout. Lost in my thoughts, I hadn't realised I'd wandered into town. This happened often. I'd walk and think, ending up far from where I'd intended. My grandpa used to do the same. He'd always say he let God guide his steps, even claiming that's how he met my grandmother. God led him straight to her. I wonder if God had led me here, wanting me to hear this after what that white kid said. I turned to see a big black man, dressed in an odd, hastily assembled robe. I almost laughed. He looked like a broke ghetto superhero.
"Why are you smiling, Edomite?"
the man shouted, eyes narrowing at me. I stopped, staring at him.
"Don't be scared now, Edomite. I know you're kind. You are the seed of the devil and hate us true Israelites,"
he yelled, pointing directly at me. I'd no idea what to say. I didn't even know what an Edomite was. People on the street paused, their eyes on me, waiting for a response.
"The devil has got his Edomite tongue, brothers,"
the man mocked. His group of similarly dressed men laughed. I was sick of being laughed at. Everywhere I went, it was either white Jews or black men mocking me.
"I am a true Hebrew. You're just confused descendants of freed slaves spouting hate for attention,"
I shouted back. The busy street fell silent. Even I was surprised by my outburst.
"Your true racist nature is showing, Edomite. You see how they always reveal themselves when faced with the true blood of the Hebrews,"
the man proclaimed to the crowd. I crossed the street and walked over to face them, feeling the eyes of the entire world on me. "Racist?" I shouted as I approached. The man smiled as I drew near.
"Yes, Edomite, that's what you are. Racist. You hate the truth that Israel is black and always will be."
I sighed, never having heard such blatant nonsense. "My father is African American, a descendant of slaves from Mississippi. My mother is a Jew from Israel. How can I be racist when my father is black? You're the one assuming my race based on my appearance." The man scrutinized me, taking in my curly hair and light brown skin. After a moment, his tone softened.
"If your father is truly black like me, then by his blood alone you are a true Hebrew Israelite, my brother. It's okay to be lost and not know who you are. That's why you're here."
He no longer looked at me like I was some ancient enemy, but rather as a newfound brother. He motioned to one of the men nearby, who quickly handed me a pamphlet.
"We are all lost in the woods the Edomites have left us in, brother. Come to our meeting and discover who you really are. There is power in your father's blood, and thus in you," the man said.
He patted my shoulder and smiled before turning to resume his shouting at passers-by. I felt an odd pull toward these people. Maybe it was because they were black, and I craved a connection to that part of me. Or maybe it was the acceptance. I'd spent my entire life feeling unaccepted. But this street preacher had called me his brother and welcomed me into his fold, despite my biracial heritage. To him and his group, my Israeli mother didn't matter. What counted was that my father was black. That was enough for them. This acceptance felt strange, like a blind man seeing the sun for the first time. Initially, it was beautiful. But I soon realized I longed for the familiar darkness. I'd grown comfortable being an outcast, molding my identity around it. I wasn't sure how long I could stand in the light of acceptance. My mother raised me, and I would never deny her or her sacrifices by claiming to be solely black. I wasn't even sure why I cared so much about being accepted by my black side. The black men I came from had abandoned me. I had never met my father and knew nothing of him beyond his name. He didn't deserve the honour of being acknowledged as part of me. As I walked home, I glanced at the pamphlet. It struck me as absurd, their claim that African Americans were the original Hebrews. From what I knew, African Americans like my father were descendants of West Africans, brought over through the transatlantic slave trade. There were no ties to Israel or ancient Hebrew bloodlines. The more I thought about it, the more I realized they were just as lost and desperate for a sense of belonging as I was. Perhaps that's why the black community treated biracial people so harshly. Ostracizing us gave them a sense of power and superiority they had never truly felt. But the joke was on them. While I might not fit in anywhere, I knew my history and culture on my mother's side. I was connected to that lineage and could draw strength from it. I had something they would never have. I was biracial, and though I struggled with my identity, I knew my roots and had been raised in one of my cultures. I wasn't as lost or empty as they were. Jeshiem. My knee throbbed as I limped to class. I had several stitches in it, and it still hurt to put pressure on it. Word spread quickly through the school that I'd been in a fight. The Arab kids stared at me and whispered among themselves in their language. I was the only half-black American kid in the entire school, so when I heard the word Abd, I knew they were talking about me. They'd called me Abd so often that it lost its sting. It didn't bother me anymore. Today was a good day. My mother had finally decided to divorce my stepfather, and we were going back to America. I couldn't wait to leave this dusty hellhole and live in the 21st century. Bahrain seemed 100 years behind the rest of the world in everything. I was surprised they even drove cars instead of using horses and buggies. They didn't even have toilet paper here. They used a cup of water and their bare hands to clean themselves, then ate with those same hands, I hated it here. The only thing I'd miss about Bahrain was Hannah. She was the mother I should have had. If I had the choice to stay in this place and be raised by her instead of going to America with my real mother, I'd choose Hannah every time. She was my diamond in the rough, the only good thing I'd found here. I'd miss her deeply.
"Why are you wearing that, Abd?"
An Arab kid sneered at me. I looked at him. He was bigger than me, but I wasn't afraid to fight. Not even on my last day, and not even with my hurt knee. I wouldn't let these ignorant Arabs bully me. I didn't realize how much Arabs hated America, and by extension Americans, until I wore my US Army jacket. Hannah had brought it for me. "Always be proud of who you are, Habibi," she had said. My actual mother took it away and told me not to wear it, but I'd snuck into her room that same day and took it back. This jacket meant more to me than just pride in my country. It was a gift from Hannah, a woman who loved me more than my own mother did. How dare my mother, who hated me, try to take away a gift given out of love? I wore that US Army jacket today, shoving my identity in their faces. They called me Abd at every opportunity, so why not act like one? "I'm leaving your backward country today and going home," I shot back. Tonight I'd be on a plane heading to America. I didn't remember anything about it. My mother brought me here shortly after I was born. I knew as much about America as the Arabs did, but it was my home, and I was excited to go. I held on to the illusion of being accepted and fitting in, of not being bullied for being black. I didn't care if what I said angered them. This was my last day, and they'd put me through hell from the moment I stepped onto their soil. "What did you say, Abd?" the Arab kid challenged. A group of Arab kids had surrounded me now, some touching my US Army jacket, others glaring. "My father died at the hands of Americans like you," another Arab kid said angrily. My heart started to race. I knew I'd have to fight my way out. I balled up my fists, ready to swing at the nearest one. "Your dusty father was a terrorist and deserved it," I spat back. I didn't care that I was being somewhat racist. They had racially oppressed me my entire life. I wasn't one to bow down and accept it. I was a fighter. I would always fight back. The day I gave up would be the day I died. The Arab kids' faces reddened with rage. They stopped trying to speak English and started berating me in Arabic. I could understand some of it, but most was gibberish. They shoved me from all sides, and instead of waiting for the first blow, I swung at the nearest kid.
"Khalas!"
A deep voice boomed. We all stopped and turned to see the principal approaching quickly. He started shouting at us in Arabic. The Arab kids hung their heads and glared at me as they walked away. Then he turned to me.
"Why do you always start trouble, Jeshiem?"
the principal asked. He was an older, brown-skinned Arab with a huge belly protruding from his thobe, making him look oddly shaped, like a pregnant man. I didn't always start trouble. Most times, trouble found me simply for existing in a country that hated everything about me. I was always blamed for everything. I learned early on not to bother defending myself. The adults would always side with the Arab kids. I would be minding my own business, trying to eat lunch, and some Arab kid would put mud in my hair. Somehow that was my fault too. My hair should have been cut or combed better, so it justified the bullying. "I didn't start anything," I replied. Unlike the Arab kids, I held my head high. This was my last day, and I wanted them all to know how happy I was to leave their country.
"You always start trouble, Jeshiem. You wear anti-Arab clothing, knowing the response you'll get," the principal said.
I sighed. Anything American was anti-Arab to them.
"Do you not like it here? We have accepted you as one of us, and you throw your American blood in our face. It's very insulting. You bring shame to the man who adopted you," the principal growled, visibly angry.
I wanted to say something back, but decided not to push my luck. I wasn't on the plane home yet. I wondered if he really thought they had accepted me.
if bullying me and replacing my name with Abd was their idea of making me feel welcome. Technically, I was half Arab, through my mother, but in this backward country, my mother's blood meant nothing. She was just a woman, and thus had no value in their society. To them, my father's black American blood was all that mattered. My stepfather tolerated me only because I was male. In Arab culture, the more sons you had, the more powerful you were. I don't remember ever having a real conversation with him, or even being acknowledged in any way.
"Take off your jacket or go home," the principal ordered.
I sighed and began limping toward the door. I wasn't going to take off my American Army jacket. It was the only thing in this country that gave me a sense of pride. I was an American, and they always made sure I knew I was different. Now, when I wanted to wear my jacket and proudly represent the very thing they used to make me feel like an outsider, they were offended. The principal shook his head in disgust.
"I will tell your father how you dishonored him today," he said.
I stopped halfway through the door. "He's not my father. My father is an Abd, remember? And besides, I'm going back home to America today," I replied. Before the principal could respond, I left the school and started to limp back home. I'd only come to school to mock the Arab kids one last time, to give them a big "fuck you" as I left their backward country forever. But somehow they had turned my intended victory into an embarrassment. They had tortured and bullied me for years, calling me every degrading, racist name their narrow minds could think of. Yet, I was the bad guy for refusing to silently endure their abuse. At least in America, I wouldn't be bullied for being black. I had a chance to be normal, to have a normal childhood, to have normal friends who did normal American kid stuff. My heart raced just thinking about it. No more sandy dirt roads, or having to act out my insults just so these Arabs could understand they were being insulted. The satisfaction of knowing they got it was lost on them. I was so lost in my thoughts about America that I didn't even realize I'd already made it home. I waved to my stepfather's guards and walked through the big iron gates. My belongings had already been packed by my stepfather's servants. He didn't seem distressed at all that my mother was divorcing him. In fact, he seemed relieved. I knew this would only worsen my mother's already foul mood toward me. For weeks, she had blamed me for the decay of her marriage. My being so black, as she put it, was a burden to her. I never understood what she meant. I was the same colour, if not lighter, than most of the Arabs here, so it couldn't be my skin tone. My hair was similar to a lot of Arabs too. Maybe it was my features, my wider nose, my fuller lips. But if I stood next to most Arabs, you couldn't tell me apart from them. At least not the Arabs here. I looked nothing like my mother. She was extremely pale with straight, jet black hair. She looked like an exotic white woman. "I hope you're proud of ruining this for me," my mother said. She glared at me as she carried her bags to the car. I wasn't sure what I'd done, but apparently her divorce was my fault. "I never wanted a black baby, and now you can see why, Jeshiem," my mother growled. I don't know why it still bothered me when she said things like that. I'd heard her regrets about having me my entire life. Each time she said it, my heart ripped, like it was hearing it for the first time. Maybe it was because it came from my mother. Being rejected by the very person who bore you scars your soul. I didn't know what to say. I just watched as my mother loaded her things into the car. "No one likes black people, Jeshiem. I don't know why Allah wouldn't let me abort you. But since you're here, try to be more Arab. You'll get further in life," my mother said. I just nodded. What else could I do? I had no choice in my birth or who my parents were. I didn't choose to be half black. That was a choice my mum had made when she'd slept with my black father. "Don't speak to him that way. If you don't want him, leave him here with me. I will love him and take care of him," Hannah said. Her voice filled with anger. I smiled at her, knowing I would miss her deeply. Leaving her behind felt like leaving my real mother. "You would like that, wouldn't you? Finally give you the son you could never have?" Abdullah married me because your womb is rotten. You're a useless woman, my mother retorted. The cruelty of her words stung Hannah deeply, and seeing her hurt made my anger flare. "Leave Hannah alone!" I shouted. Before I could say anything else, my mother stormed over and slapped me hard across the face. I stumbled back, rubbing my cheek. "Don't forget your place, you black bastard!" my mother yelled. I could see the battle waging in her eyes. She hated me. She resented my very existence in her life. She cursed me for taking up space in her womb. But there was a small part of her that was forced to care for me. I wouldn't call it love. It was more an obligation. I came from her, and no matter how much she wanted to let me go, the biological connection wouldn't allow her to. I fought back the tears that threatened to pour out, rubbing my cheek. "Yes, I responded quietly. "As for you, he is my son. As black as he may be, he is mine," my mother growled. She pointed a long, pale finger at Hannah. I could see the pain in Hannah's eyes as she fought back tears. She wasn't afraid of my mother. She had more respect and dignity than my mother ever did. Hannah was regal and kind, where my mother was bitter and harsh. "I love you, Jeshiem. While you are in America, please don't forget me or Allah," Hannah said. Her voice was filled with pain. I wanted to run to her, to hug her, to tell her that I loved her too, that she was the only real mother I'd ever had. But she turned and quickly walked back into the house. The tears I'd been holding back from my mother's slap finally ran freely down my face. My heart was broken. Not from my mother's cruelty, but for Hannah. I would miss her dearly, and for some reason I knew I would never see her again. Hunxie. My arm still hurt as I walked home. I'd probably have a bruise there. I was nearly a mile away from the store, but I could still feel the judgmental eyes boring into my back. I didn't understand the hate people had for biracial individuals. We didn't choose to be born this way. Most of us would probably choose anything but to be biracial if given the option. For some reason, society blamed us for existing, but absolved those who created us. How were we to blame while our parents, who had bitten the forbidden fruit, were free from fault? My mother was an outcast from the community she had chosen to stay in, because they knew her, and by extension, me. But she could move to a new Chinese community where no one knew of her past with my father, where she could start fresh. I blamed myself for my mother's suffering. She loved me and wouldn't abandon me, no matter how miserable it made her. I often wondered if she hated me or regretted having me. Her life would have been so much easier if she had just left me at a fire station. Some family would have taken me in, and she could have restarted her life. My mother was honourable, always speaking of the importance of honouring one's elders and ancestors. She would not dishonour them by abandoning her child. The blood of her ancestors ran in my veins, and she feared their judgment more than the racism of the community she lived in. I hated what my existence had put her through. Like me, she just wanted acceptance. But unlike me, she could get that back. I never had it and never would. I knew my mother would pay for what happened today. I only hoped they'd go easy on her. My heart raced as I neared my mother's house. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She owned it outright, having worked tirelessly to stake her claim here in America. Her family had lost everything in China due to the civil conflicts against the government. She rarely spoke of those times, but I knew they weighed heavily on her and shaped the way she lived now. My mother often had nightmares. She would wake up drenched in sweat and trembling. I wondered what she dreamed about, but I could never find the courage to ask her. The haunted look in her eyes was enough for me to respect her silence. "Ma, I'm home!" I called out as I entered the house. My mother didn't answer, which was strange. She always waited by the door, smiling. I loved my mother. She was my anchor in a world that wanted to throw me away simply for being mixed. She was a warrior who kept the wolves at bay.
It would break my heart if she were disappointed in me. I walked into the kitchen and saw her sitting at the table, her head resting on it. By the way her back heaved, I could tell she was crying. "Ma?" I started. She held up her hand, taking several deep breaths to calm herself, before turning to me. My mother was still very pretty and well kept for her age. She could easily find a husband who would love and care for her. But the hardness in her eyes obscured the beauty and youth she still possessed. This world had chewed her up and spit her out. I, her half-black daughter, was all she had left. Just as she was my anchor in a positive way, I was hers, but in a way that dragged her down and threatened to drown her. "What happened at the store, Hunxie?" my mother asked, her voice cracking with emotion. I'd never seen her like this. I knew word travelled fast in our small community, but I had left the store less than an hour ago. "An elder attacked me for being half-black," I started, but my mother held up her hand and took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. She wrung her hands and stared off into the distance, physically here but mentally far away. "My biggest regret, Hunxie, is meeting your father. Not because I regret having you, beloved." My mother paused, looking at me with tears and love in her eyes. I couldn't help but cry with her. Seeing my mother, as strong as she was, break down like this, shattered me in ways I couldn't put into words. "It's because of how backward the thinking of my people is," my mother continued, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She took several deep breaths as I walked over and hugged her. She patted my hand, not inquiring further about what had happened at the store. She had been fighting my battles against the bigotry of the Chinese community since the day she met my father. My mother had sacrificed so much for love. She would have fought the world for my father. She loved him dearly. It broke her heart when he abandoned her, leaving her to fend for herself in a world he had turned upside down. She had made herself a pariah in her own community for the sake of his love. Like so many others, he got what he wanted and left her with a broken heart and a child. My father was a fool for leaving a woman as loyal and beautiful as my mother. "The council called me. I have to kick you out or we both leave. So I'll pack our things and see if I can sell the house," my mother said. I didn't understand how they could make her leave. She owned this house outright. She'd worked herself nearly to death for years to pay it off. They couldn't just kick her out. "You own this house, Ma. They can't kick you out," I said. My mother shook her head. "They've put a lien on the house and can foreclose on it. It was part of the contract I signed when agreeing to come here. I have to abide by the council," she replied. I sighed. This was just a way for the council to extort poor Chinese immigrants. I couldn't let them kick my mother out. This was her life. She had poured so many years of tears and hard work into owning this house. I decided then that I would leave. I didn't know where I would go, but I couldn't stay. I had always been a burden on my mother, and the thought of her having to start over because of me was something my heart couldn't bear. "Don't pack, Ma," I said. My mother turned and looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. I couldn't hide anything from her. How could I? I came from her. She gave birth to me and raised me. She knew me better than I knew myself. "I won't allow it, Hunxie," my mother said. She knew what I was planning. To leave so she could keep the house. So she wouldn't have to start over again. Besides, I was nearly an adult, and I wanted to leave this wretched community anyway. I was tired of being here, tired of being the daughter of a black demon. This community was a prison to me, and I would gladly leave it to save my mother from losing everything she had worked for. My mother started to cry again, and I couldn't help but cry with her. I'd never been without her. I didn't know how I would live or eat. But after all my mother had endured, this was the least I could do for her. My mixed blood had weighed her down so much. She deserved to be free of me. She deserved to find love and restart her life.
There is no life and no home without you in it, Hunxie, my mother said. She hugged me tightly as she sobbed into my chest. I was already much taller than her. The strong, powerful woman I loved and adored felt like a fragile child in my arms. I kissed her on the top of her head, just as she had done for me countless times. I want to go, Ma. I hate it here. Let me do this for both of us, I pleaded with her. I knew what I was asking would be hard for her. I was her only family here. She had raised me alone, and I was asking her to part with her heart, to wonder how she could live without it. My mother was my heart too. I would go to the ends of the earth and back for her. There was nothing I could do or give her that could repay all that she had done for me. Even if I tried, she would never accept it. My mother pulled away and cupped my face with her small hands, smiling proudly at me. I left home around your age too. I was dreading this day, but I'm proud that you are more like me than your father, my mother said. She let go of me and hurried out of the kitchen. I sat down at the table, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. I was really going to leave. I was going to be homeless to save my mother and free myself from the bigoted, oppressive culture of my Chinese half. As brave as I made myself sound, I was scared. I'd always had my mum and this house. No matter how bad or hard a day I had, my mother and her home had always been my refuge. My mother returned with an old lockbox, setting it down on the table before unlocking it. Inside were several stacks of different currencies. She reached for a stack of hundreds and handed it to me. This is nearly $5,000. I've been saving it for your college. You'll need it now, so take it, she said. Her hand shook as she placed the stack of money in front of me. Ma? I began. She gently patted my hand. What you're doing, Hunxie, is very honourable. I'm so very proud of you and very sad at the same time. Please, beloved, take the money. At least I'll know you won't be cold or hungry, my mother said, her voice cracking with pain. The thought of me being on my own was hard for her. She wasn't ready for me to leave. Seeing the pain in her eyes made me hate the Chinese community even more. It made me wish I wasn't the daughter of a black man. My father had caused so much pain and hardship for both of us. I hated him just as much as I hated the Chinese community. How could he be such a coward? How could he abandon my mother and me to face the anti-black racism of the Chinese community? He, of all people, should have known how other races viewed black people. In my eyes, he was heartless and the worst kind of coward. To leave your flesh and blood in the hands of racists was as unforgivable as it was pathetic. I sighed deeply and placed the money in my purse. I was going to leave tonight. If I didn't, I knew I wouldn't be able to. My mother's home and security depended on me leaving a community that hated me for being a half-breed and shunned my mother for having me. I tried to force a smile on my face, despite my heartbreak. I didn't want my mother to see how truly scared I was to be in the world alone. I was like a prisoner who hated prison and longed for freedom, but had been in prison so long that the thought of freedom terrified me, because I had no clue how to survive on my own, how to exist outside the walls I both hated and loved. "I'm sorry, Ma," I said. My mother looked confused. "For what, beloved?" she asked. "For being born like this," I replied. Benji. I couldn't stop thinking about the pamphlet the man had given me. I kept it folded up in my back pocket, pulling it out to sit on the edge of my bed and just stare at it. A lot of what they believed in seemed made up, like it was created to fill some void. But for me, it went deeper than that. He'd called me brother. Once he found out my father was a black man, he spoke to me like I was one of his people. I was embraced as though I were a long-lost brother who had finally found his way home. I was conflicted.
Their beliefs seemed like clear nonsense, so different from what my mother had taught me and the way I was raised. It felt like they had invented their doctrine to counter their own identity crisis. For all their bluster and talk, Black Americans were just as lost when it came to identity as I was. They clung to religions to fill the gap of having no cultural identity outside of being descendants of slaves. They created these false narratives of being ancient Egyptians or the original Jews to patch the hole in their souls, the emptiness of not knowing who they were or where they fit in. You would think that, of all people, they would understand the emptiness that biracial individuals feel. But instead of embracing us, they abandon us, reminding us that we're not black enough to be like them. They hate us and oppress us. I always found it troubling how a people could survive racial atrocities, only to turn round and inflict the same kind of pain on another group. These Hebrew Israelites were no different. They, the descendants of slaves, had convinced themselves they were God's chosen and the original Jews, just to avoid the emptiness of lacking a cultural backbone, of not accepting that their culture in America was rooted in slavery and oppression. They are a people of pain, a soulful people who have fought for everything they have and are still fighting to find themselves. Maybe I was better off than them simply because I didn't pretend to be something I wasn't. I'm the son of a black man and an Israeli woman, and I'm okay with that. My struggle is with everyone else who seems to hate me for it. Maybe biracial people were God's chosen, and that's why everyone hated us so much. Despite how I felt about their beliefs, it felt good to be accepted for once in my life, to be around my father's people and not be called a half-breed or an Oreo. Despite my doubts and fears, I found myself standing outside the address on the pamphlet. It was an older house in what looked like the hood. The area and the houses around it were as run down as the people who lived there. I guess it's true that you are a reflection of your surroundings. The black Americans in this neighbourhood seemed just as abandoned and condemned as the houses that populated their streets. What am I doing here? I whispered to myself. I was extremely light-skinned, with curly hair, standing out like a sore thumb. As if that wasn't enough, I wore clothes that were new, clean, and actually fit. Everything about me screamed that I wasn't from here.
"What are you doing outside our temple, young brother?" a voice boomed from behind me.
I turned to see several black men approaching. They all wore the same old robes as the man who had given me the pamphlet, looking like ghetto superheroes. It was hard not to laugh. I didn't know how to respond, so I dug into my back pocket and pulled out the pamphlet. One of the oddly dressed men looked at it, and then at me.
"Welcome, my half-Edomite brother," the man said. "Don't call him that. He is the seed of his father. He is just as much one of us as you are," another man corrected him. The first man's dark face looked ashen as he was scolded. I turned to see the man who had given me the pamphlet. He wasn't dressed in the same robes as the others. Instead, he wore jeans and a purple sweatshirt, with Greek fraternity letters on it. "Forgive me, honourable brother Isus," the first man said.
He and the others bowed their heads in respect. Jesus looked at me and smiled.
"I'm glad you came, little brother," Jesus said.
He embraced me, and I felt strange being hugged by another man. I'd never been embraced like this by anyone except my mother.
"Welcome, brother," the other men echoed.
I couldn't help but smile.
"The meeting is in here,"
Jesus said, motioning toward the house. He gestured for me to follow, opening the door to reveal an interior that was surprisingly clean and well kept, a stark contrast to the house's worn exterior.
"Cleanliness is pleasing to God, little brother. No matter how our outer appearance may look, our souls are clean and our temple reflects this truth," Jesus said.
I pondered his words. Maybe I'd been misjudging these men based on their outward appearance and ridiculous outfits. They seemed very different now, in person, than they did when shouting on the streets. Inside, the house was huge. It smelled of incense and was decorated with Hebrew symbols. Some of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen sat on a plush white couch. One woman's flawless ebony skin made her look almost unreal. She wore white robes and a scarf that covered her black hair. She smiled at me, her teeth as white as snow on an empty field. Her eyes shone with a light I hadn't seen before. I could feel my cheeks redden. I smiled back and looked at the floor.
"Hebrew women are beautiful, aren't they?"
Jesus said, noticing my reaction. He and the other brothers laughed as they saw me blush, but I could tell they were proud of her and their other Hebrew sisters. Jesus led me down some stairs into their basement. The floors were marble, so clean I wouldn't hesitate to eat off them. It felt like I'd been transported to a different world. The marble walls were painted purple and waxed until they glowed in the soft light. In the centre of the room was a golden chair, adorned with purple pillows. Jesus hurried over to the chair and sat down. I watched as the other men sat cross-legged in front of him, like acolytes eager to study at the feet of their priest. Jesus pointed to an empty spot on the marble floor. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the eyes of the other men on me. I started to feel uncomfortable.
"It's okay, little brother. I know the fake Jews have poisoned your mind and planted seeds of doubt in your Israelite soul. It is the blood of your father that fights their teachings," Jesus said.
He seemed to glow with a different kind of light now. He wasn't the same man I'd seen on the street corner, where he was a warrior calling his followers to action. Outside the house, he was a brother welcoming a long-lost sibling home. But here he seemed like a prophet, as if he had spoken directly to God. I couldn't look at him. His presence was too bright. I bowed my head.
"Of all the people who heard my message, it was you whose heart was touched. The blood of your father is strong in you."
"It brought you here, brother," Jesus said. The other men sat with their eyes closed, lost in meditation. Had I stumbled into a cult? A surge of fear shot through me.
"I know the fake Jews you were raised with called you a nigger and mocked the royal black true Hebrew blood that runs in your blessed veins. I know you always felt outcast and alone among them. The most alone you ever felt was when you were in their temples, surrounded by them," Jesus continued. I was confused. How could he know about these things? Who was this man? How do you know?" I stammered. Jesus smiled. "I know because the great Yeshua told me. He said you felt alone because you always knew you were different. You were a lost lamb in a den of wolves," Jesus said.
My heart pounded in my chest. I stumbled over to the spot he had pointed out and sat before him. He smiled down at me. I felt like a blind man seeing the glory of the sun for the first time. He held out his hand. I stared at it for a moment, then leaned forward and pressed my forehead against it in reverence. He had me, and he knew it. He saw my deepest pain and held the key to making it go away. After that meeting, I found myself doubting everything my mother had taught me about being Jewish. Jesus told me that the Jews had started slavery to torture and erase the true Hebrews, that they were behind the suffering of my father's people, and by extension my suffering too. Everything he said about how they hated me rang true. I could recall countless encounters with the European Jews who called me racial slurs or attacked me for simply existing. It all made sense to me. I was living proof of it. As Jesus had said, I always felt out of place, always felt different, but could never pinpoint why. I had spent the last month studying and learning from Brother Jesus. Every day I left his temple, I hated the European Jews more. Every encounter in my life with them was tainted by their disdain for my father's blood. I wanted them to pay. They couldn't get away with what they had done to my people, to me. "We have to make them pay, Brother Jesus," I said during my daily meeting at the temple. This place had become like a second home to me. My mother had been curious at first about where I was spending my time, but when I told her I'd found some black Jewish people, she smiled. All she wanted was for me to feel accepted somewhere. She knew I struggled with fitting in. Whatever misgivings she had, she kept to herself. She was just happy that I was happy. Sometimes I wished she had asked more questions about the people I was spending time with. I could never lie to my mother. I don't blame her for what I was starting to become. I knew she wanted me to find my way, to find a place where I wasn't just the half-black Jewish kid.
We will, Brother Ben. I have a special task for you. As I've told you many times, you are our chosen one, Brother Jesus replied, patting me on the head.
Over the past month, they'd treated me like a hero, like a long-lost saviour who had set them free. I was their New Age muser, destined to lead the Hebrews from bondage once again. I was so blinded by their acceptance and praise that I didn't see that they were using me. Maybe I truly was cursed, the seed of a cursed man, the apple that fell too close to the root of a vile tree.
Saturday morning we will send a message loud and clear to the fake European Jews. It's time for us to reclaim our heritage and let the world know we will no longer be denied what's ours, Brother Jesus said.
I smiled. I would finally get to make them pay for all their hate, for all the times they cursed me for being half-black. I would get my revenge. I would be the one to strike the blow. I was the chosen one. Jeshiem. Go back to Saudi Arabia, you sand monkey, a black kid spat in my face. I'd been in America for just over a week. My mother had bought a house in the hood, a term I didn't understand until I asked someone. It's essentially a run-down, crime-ridden area where predominantly poor people live, mostly people of colour. I remembered the excitement I felt as we were getting ready to land. I proudly picked out my afro, like I'd seen so many black people do on TV. I thought I was finally home, that I would be among people who understood me, people who looked like me, people who wouldn't call me an American abd or mock me for being a descendant of the American slave trade. I was a fool for expecting to be treated differently. The black kids in America were no different from the Arab kids thousands of miles away. In Saudi, I was an abd, their version of the N-word. In America, I was just an Arab. I wasn't black enough for them. My father is black, and I was born here, I shot back. The black kid laughed at me. You're just an Arab Oreo. You're not like us, he replied. I didn't understand his anger. This was my first day at school in the hood. I'd thought that American education would be better than what I had in Saudi Arabia. But I was wrong. I was far more advanced than nearly all the kids in my grade. Most of the boys could barely read a children's book. Even with my obvious stutter, I read circles around them. I wondered if this was why he was so angry at me. The teacher had called him up before me, and he struggled to read a simple sentence. He was like most kids in my class. When it was my turn, I stuttered through the entire chapter with ease, and I even read it in Arabic to impress my teacher. While my teacher was delighted, the other kids hated me for it. I couldn't understand it. We were the same age and in the same grade, but they could barely read or write their names. At least the bullies in Saudi Arabia were somewhat intelligent. The American black kids were poor, illiterate, and seemed to excel only in fighting and sports, activities that took little brain power. I wondered if this was why Arabs mocked me, if this was what being black American was. I didn't want it. Where were the men like Malcolm X and Dr. King, the black leaders who gave speeches that shook the world to its core? Were they ever real? Or were they made up to make this beaten-down race look better than it truly was? I was disappointed. I'd expected to find Black Panthers and intellectuals like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Instead, I was met with violent thugs who could barely recite their ABCs. I never thought I would miss Saudi Arabia. Outside of Hana, I'd hated that place. But Saudi Arabia was all I'd known. Now that I was in the country of my birth, among people who shared my father's skin tone and ancestry, I wished I'd stayed in Saudi. You may look a little like us, have one of us as a father, but you're not like us.
You don't talk like us, you don't act like us, and you haven't lived like us, the black kid said.
He stared hard into my eyes, his brow furrowed in hatred. I didn't understand where this hatred was coming from. I felt sick to my stomach that for years all I wanted was to be him, to be a part of my father's culture. I started to understand why Arabs hated them so much. They were dumb and entitled. Instead of taking the time to better themselves, they wallowed in self-pity and blamed the world for their problems.
If being like you means I can't read, then I'll happily just be an Arab, I shot back.
The black kid looked shocked, like I had struck a nerve.
That's why we don't trust you half-breeds. You hate your black side and think you're better than us, the black kid said.
I was confused. He had started attacking me, calling me racial slurs because I was half Arab and mixed. Yet, somehow, I was the one who hated him. I sighed. There was no winning this argument. I felt like I was arguing with a 2-year-old. They didn't understand anything I said and just threw back random insults that made no sense in the context of our argument. It was odd that the black boys hated me so much, but the black girls loved me. They weren't like their male counterparts. They could read, write, and hold a conversation. I found them beautiful. I was in awe of their beauty and grace. They were warriors who had to fight both the world and their own men. I was baffled by how such women could come from the same race as the men. I sighed again. There was no winning this argument. How could you win any intellectual back and forth with someone who clearly wasn't an intellectual? It was like a blind person who had never seen the sun trying to argue with you about what the sun looked like. I shrugged and started to walk away.
That's right, you dirty Arab. Walk away. You're a pretend black person, the big dumb black kid shouted.
I didn't even turn to respond. I just kept walking. This had been my life since I arrived in America. As much as I tried to act like it didn't sting, it did. It pierced my heart every time I was told I wasn't enough. Every rejection felt like a spear in my gut. And, to make it worse, I had no one to talk to about it. That day at school was long. Every black kid seemed to stare at me like I was a skinwalker impersonating them. I felt uncomfortable in my own skin. I hated being biracial. I wished I were either just black or Arab. Being biracial had no upside. It was all downside. Being isolated and hated for simply existing was depressing. As much as I pretended it didn't bother me, it did. When I got home, I did what I often did. I sat in the shower. I let the hot water run over my curly afro and cried. I didn't want my mum to see me crying. She hated me enough already. The last thing I needed was for her to think I was weak. Sometimes I'd sit in the shower until the hot water ran out. The shower was my safe space, a place where I could escape the hate and disappointment of my mother and the reality of being biracial in a world that treated us like a plague. I sighed deeply as the steaming hot water started to cool. I didn't know how long I'd been in there, but it had to have been a while. My fingers were pruned and my head throbbed from crying. I stood up and turned off the water, grabbing a towel to dry myself. It was nearly dinner time, which meant facing my mother and hearing about how much she hated my father and wished she had never had a black child. I had ruined her life. She never missed an opportunity to remind me how black and worthless I was to her. At school, it was the opposite. To the black kids, I was just an Arab half-breed, and they never let me forget how much they hated me for being half Arab. I dressed quickly and sat at the table. As usual, my mother stared at me and began her nightly monologue about how much of a burden I was on her life. The food tasted bland and lifeless. After dinner, I cleared the table and started to wash the dishes, my heart heavy. I'd started to hate the day I was born. Some days, I wished my mother had succeeded in aborting me. Somehow she blamed me for that failure too. Even as a fetus, I was a bane on her existence. I was so lost in my depression that I didn't notice the knives on the counter. I accidentally grabbed a blade, and it cut deep into my palm. I stared at the wound, watching the blood seep out and drip onto the kitchen floor. For some reason it felt good. Seeing the open wound and watching my cursed, mixed blood drip from it was therapeutic. I sighed deeply in relief. It felt strange, but for a moment, the pressure that had been weighing me down seemed to lift. I felt like I could breathe again. For a brief moment, I felt normal. I didn't understand why seeing my mixed blood drip from that gash made me feel so good, but I didn't want it to stop. I needed those few moments of normalcy, that brief feeling of relief. Watching my blood drip from my tan skin opened up a new world for me. Every time I had a bad day, I would come home, grab a knife from my mother's kitchen, lock my bedroom door, and silently run the blade along my forearm, just next to the crook of my elbow. I didn't want the cuts to be visible. I didn't want to have to answer questions about them. I was addicted. That first accidental cut was all it took. Like a fiend, I couldn't get enough of it. Some days I would cut myself several times. Days like this, when I was told to go back to the sands, when black kids would tell me I wasn't black enough, when the pain and isolation were too much for me to bear. Each cut took away the weight of being biracial in a world where everyone hated my existence. I started to wear long-sleeve shirts. Even on the hottest Arizona days I wore them. Like an addict hiding his track marks, I had to hide my cuts and scars. I was ashamed of them. I had a problem. I hated myself, and the only joy I could find any more was in hurting myself and watching the mixed blood I'd been cursed with fall from my skin. No matter how much of my blood I spilled, I was still mixed. I couldn't escape who and what I was. "What are you doing?" my mother asked. Her pale face showed no hint of concern. She had caught me in the act, my cut and scarred arm exposed, blood dripping from a fresh wound. She didn't seem to care. She stared at my arm for a moment, her face as emotionless as a statue. I started to cry. She hated me so much that she didn't care if I hurt myself. She didn't care that I was in so much pain that this was the only way I could escape it. She didn't care that I hated myself. I hated my curly hair and my light brown skin. I hated being called a nigger by Arabs and a sand nigger by black Americans. I hated my stutter. I hated everything about being me. Most of all, I hated that my mother hated me too. How could I love myself if the woman who gave me life couldn't find a reason to love me? She had pictures of herself holding my siblings as babies, but none of me. She was proud of her Arab kids, but couldn't stand the sight of me. "Why don't you love me, Mum?" I sobbed. My mother's expression didn't change. She leaned down and kissed me on the forehead. "I just can't," she replied. She looked deeply into my eyes as I cried. I don't know why, but her words broke my heart deeper than ever before. I knew she hated me. She had always let it be known that she wished she had aborted me, but to look at me with blood dripping from my arm, knowing I had cut myself, and not even find the words to lie for my comfort, that hurt. She might as well have taken that knife from my hand and plunged it into my heart. How could she not look at me and see part of herself? "You're doing it wrong, Jeshiem. If you really want to cut, do it down your arm, not across," my mother said. She grabbed the knife and showed me, running the tip of the blade down my arm, softly enough not to cut me. "This way, you bleed a lot more," she said. As abruptly as she had come, she got up and left. Hunxie. I shivered as I stepped out into the cold. I didn't know where I was going, but I was doing this. I wouldn't let my mother suffer because of me any more. I waited for my mother to fall asleep. It never took long. She always worked hard and was constantly tired. I covered her slender form with a blanket and quietly left. I had packed my bags earlier, just a single suitcase on wheels. For the first time in my life, I was truly homeless. I didn't know where my next meal would come from, or where I would lay my head. All that mattered was that my mother's home was safe, that she wouldn't have to start over. I could never repay her for all that she'd given me and sacrificed for me, but this was a start. I walked down the street slowly, taking in the buildings and homes of old Chinatown. The more I walked, the more I realized I wouldn't miss this place. I grew up here, but I hated it. This place had been unkind to me and my mother. Tears welled up and clouded my vision. "Don't cry, Hunxie," I told myself. "These people in this place weren't worth my tears." As much as I tried to fight them, the tears stubbornly fell anyway. Maybe my soul needed to cry, to release the pent-up pain and rage that had tormented me for years. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and kept walking. It was past 1 a.m., and I had no clue where I was going. I had some money, but I didn't want to waste it all on hotels. I sighed, knowing I'd have to call him. I didn't want to. I didn't remember him at all, nor had I seen a recent picture of him. But what other option did I have? I stared at old Chinatown for a moment longer and continued walking, wrapping my jacket around me tighter. What would I say to him? My first conversation with him after nearly 20 years of silence would be asking for help. He did owe me. He'd been absent my entire life. Would he see it that way? Did he even think of me? Did he not wonder how his daughter, whom he'd never met, was doing? Then again, if he didn't care enough to be in my life, why would he care enough to think about me? I sighed and sat on a bench, watching the fog of my breath in the cold night air. My heart raced. I had his number for a long time. I knew where he lived and followed him on Facebook. He had a whole new family and kids. He seemed happy without me and my mother, as if he had erased our existence and pain from his memory. He didn't know I followed him. I'd never had the courage to reach out. Why should I? He was my father and had abandoned me. He should be begging to be in my life, not me begging to be in his. My hand shook as I pressed his contact photo on my phone. It was past 1 a.m. I didn't know if he would answer. I hoped he would. His social media said he worked hospital security at night. The phone rang several times, and each ring made me feel like I was going to have a heart attack. "Hello?" A man's voice finally answered. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there for a moment. It was really him. My father, whom I'd never met, was on the phone. "Hello? Hello?" the man said again, his tone irritated. I still couldn't find the words to say anything. "I can hear you breathing, you fucking weirdo," he said. I took a deep breath. "Dad?" I said. It felt strange to say that. My entire life I'd never called anyone Dad. Now here I was talking to my father for the first time, and all I could say was, "Dad?" The man was silent for a moment. He seemed lost in thought, as if trying to figure out which kid was calling him. I knew he didn't recognize my voice. "Who is this?" he asked. My whole body shook. It was cold outside, but the chill I felt wasn't from the weather. "It's Hunxie, Dad," I replied. I could hear the cracks in my voice. I was trying hard to control my emotions, but I was losing that battle. "Hunxie?" he repeated, sounding confused. I could tell he was searching his memory, trying to place my name and recall the face of the woman he had broken. It pained me to know that I wasn't even an afterthought to him. My mother had loved this man so much, had destroyed her life for him, and he couldn't even remember her name. My mother still loved this man. If he showed up at her doorstep, she'd take him in like nothing had happened, like he hadn't abandoned her with a child for nearly 20 years. "Ah, how are you?" he said awkwardly, as if only just remembering who I was. "I'm okay, Dad," I said. There was a moment of silence. We were both trying to figure out what to say next. I didn't feel right asking this man for anything. He hadn't even remembered that I existed. He'd stopped caring about me the moment he walked away. "I'm sorry for calling," I said, breaking the silence. I could hear him sigh deeply. I didn't want to hear anything he had to say. His excuses would only anger me. I hung up the phone. It was clear that he had never thought about me, never wondered how I was. He'd moved on with his life. I had meant nothing to him. My phone rang. He was calling me back. I declined the call and sent him a text message. I wasn't ready to talk to him. He would have to understand that. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. "Damn it!" I sighed. Hot tears rolled down my cheeks. He didn't deserve these tears. I stood up and started to walk again. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to walk. How could he just forget about me? I asked myself. Maybe he hated me because I was half Chinese. He clearly loved his other kids. He treated them well and took them on vacations. He was happily married and enjoying his life, while I was forgotten, like the woman he had abandoned. Was he a deadbeat? He took care of his other kids. He seemed like an amazing father. It was just me he didn't want or love. That made the pain worse. He was capable of being a good father. He just chose not to when it came to me. I didn't bother to wipe the tears that fell freely. I didn't know why I stalked his page. I often imagined being one of his other kids. I dreamed that I was on vacation with him, that he loved me like he loved them. I had to stop this. I had to let him go. He'd clearly let me go a long time ago. I was so lost in my thoughts that I lost track of time and direction. I had no clue where I was. Everything looked run down. Most of the houses were abandoned, and there were several vacant lots filled with trash. It started to rain. I looked up into the night sky and sighed. My first night on my own, and I was cold and lost in the rain. I had no idea where I was. "Fuck!" I screamed. I didn't care if anyone heard me. I doubted anyone did. I looked around for a place to get out of the rain. My suitcase had wheels, but it wasn't rainproof. I spotted a big red sign that read, "Mama's Soul Food." Next to it was a small nook that was out of the rain. I ran to it and sat down. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My head hurt. When people spoke of having a broken heart, it was always about emotional pain. They never told you that a truly broken heart makes your entire chest ache. I pulled out a small blanket from my suitcase, leaned against the wall, and laid my suitcase flat next to me. I stared at the bright red sign and thought about my mother. I missed her. I knew she was asleep, and it would be hard for her when she woke up and discovered I was gone. "Oh, child," I heard a voice say. I didn't remember falling asleep, but clearly I had. I was exhausted. "You okay, baby?" the woman's voice asked. I opened my eyes suddenly. I was afraid. I'd never been on the streets before, let alone slept on them. "Don't be startled, child. You hungry?" the woman asked. She had a kind, motherly voice. I didn't know why, but I started to cry. It had only been a night, but I missed my mother dearly. The woman was black, heavy-set and elderly. She leaned down and hugged me.
"It's okay, honey. Don't cry," she said, patting me on the back.
I couldn't help but let it all out. She was kind and the shoulder I needed.
"You're gonna feel better after this, baby. Trust me. A good cry is the soul's way of cleaning itself," the woman said, her voice carrying a deep southern accent.
After a moment of holding me as I sobbed like a baby in her arms, I remembered she was a stranger and pulled away.
I'm sorry," I stammered.
The woman looked offended.
"No need to be sorry. My shoulders are strong, and many have cried on them," she replied.
I quickly folded up my blanket and put it back in my suitcase. I was embarrassed.
"Don't go rushing off yet, sweetie. Help me open up my kitchen and get you something to eat," she said.
I was hungry, but I was still hesitant.
"Crying on these old shoulders is not free now," the woman said, her warm smile melting my heart.
I nodded and waited as she fumbled with the keys to her restaurant. "I take it you're Mama?" I asked, pointing to the big red sign. The woman nodded and smiled.
"I've been here since I was about your age," the woman replied.
She found the right key and opened the door. She hurried in and turned on the lights. I followed behind her, thankful for the warmth. Her restaurant had the look of an old 60s diner. It felt like going to your grandmother's house, knowing she had something amazing cooking in the oven. This place felt like home.
"Have a seat here," the woman said, pointing to a booth. "I need about 30 minutes to get us a good meal going. The bathroom is down the hall. Go wash up."
I didn't know why, but I felt comfortable with this elderly black woman. I smiled at her. "Thank you," I said. The older woman smiled back at me.
"I want to hear your story over a good southern breakfast," she said.
I nodded. I owed her that.
Benji. My heart raced as I walked into the temple. I could hardly breathe. I watched as all the white men and women who claimed to be Jews entered. I didn't realize how much I hated them until Jesus came into my life. I had buried the racial slurs and the pain of being outcast because I was half black. I took their insults and hate, thinking it was the right thing to do. I endured their bullying because the world told people like me to turn the other cheek, and punished those who fought back against oppression. I was a slave, and I didn't even know it. I had been their biracial whipping boy. I never saw how bad it truly was until Jesus opened my eyes. Why would I have seen it? It was all I'd ever known. It was like asking a slave born into bondage what freedom was like. He wouldn't know. He hardly thought of freedom. I was the same way. Their hate and rejection were all I'd ever known. I thought it was a normal part of life for Jewish half-breeds like me. But the reality was, they were the imposters. I was the true Jew, and they knew it. They hated me for being God's chosen. No matter how much they pretended to be of the true Hebrew blood, they never could truly be. Hebrews were of the bloodline of my Israeli mother, the amazing woman who was kicked out of Israel for not agreeing with the Zionist agenda, and of my black, deadbeat father, who was taught that he was just a descendant of slaves and nothing more. Deep down they knew they were imposters, and that's why they hated me. But today, they would pay. All of their slurs and hate would come back to burn them. They would feel the sting and pain they had inflicted on me just for existing. I didn't ask to be born biracial. I didn't ask to be of the true Hebrew blood and thus be hated. I just wanted to live. I just wanted to be like every other kid. My mother didn't deserve the hate she got. She didn't deserve the pain and rejection from her community for falling in love with a black man. She didn't deserve to be abandoned by him and left to struggle in an anti-black world with a half-breed son.
The Bible says that the devil was the most beautiful of angels, an angel of light. He shows himself to men as that same angel of light. These white Jews were the devil. They pretended to be holy and good, but all they did was evil. They hid behind smiles and false piety. I sat and watched as they greeted each other, their pale European faces beaming with the privilege of those who didn't have a care in the world, who had not truly suffered. I wondered if that's why they clung to the horrors of the Holocaust, horrors that actual Israeli Jews were saved from, horrors that happened to European Jews at the hands of other Europeans. I've never been their oppressor. Black people had never done anything to Jews. Yet for some odd reason, they hated black people and half-breeds alike, but loved their fellow white man who had oppressed them. Jesus had taught me so much. I couldn't believe I was so lost before. They smiled and shook each other's hands as they came in, like cockroaches gathering around a fresh pile of garbage. "Benji?" a woman's voice asked. I took a deep breath. Why did she have to come? She never comes to the temple. Of all the days she chose today. I pretended not to hear her. She was beautiful, and I wasn't sure I could follow through if I looked at her. She was a young Israeli girl from my mother's land. Her eyes were soft, deep brown like autumn leaves. I secretly loved her. I'd imagined marrying her. "Benji?" she said again. I shuddered. She wasn't the enemy. She wasn't like these fake Jews. She wasn't European. She couldn't be here. I turned to her, unable to hide the fear and anxiety in my eyes. "Leave now," I whispered. She looked at me. Oh, she was so beautiful. Her long brown hair fell to her slender shoulders. Her skin seemed kissed with a light brown hue. Her full, inviting lips and her beautiful face furrowed, thinking I was insulting her. She stared into my eyes for a moment, then nodded. She understood something was not right. She didn't know what, but it was enough to make her leave. I sighed deeply. I couldn't bear to hurt her. The doors of the temple were starting to close. I could see the brothers of Jesus hurrying to get out of the temple. They were to chain the doors shut. Not even me. I wouldn't want to escape anyway. I couldn't face my mother with what I had done. I couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her eyes, knowing her son was a terrorist. I wanted her to remember me as the boy who just wanted to fit in. The boy who loved his mother and cried when he was called a half-breed. I didn't want her to know me as the freedom fighter I'd become. Brother Jesus had warned me that most wouldn't understand the mission I was called to. All the prophets and chosen of God were once mocked and called crazy. It wasn't until long after their missions were completed, and they had passed, that people started to understand. This was no different. They would call me a terrorist and claim I had some Islamic influence, instead of seeing the truth. I was a biracial boy, hated and bullied by the white Jewish community, a community I was raised in. I was Jewish myself, yet I'd been lied to my entire life about who I was. They would never see it. Everyone was seated. Brother Jesus and his disciples stood outside the temple, blocking anyone else from coming in. Whatever security this temple had, they had taken them out. I knew this would be my last day on earth. My last day as a biracial boy that everyone hated. Strangely, I was okay with that. I smiled and walked between the aisles. The temple had long rows of cushioned seats, separated by a gap down the middle for people to walk. I stood in the gap and stared at everyone. They were so foolish, so secure in their privilege and false identity as God's chosen, that they couldn't fathom the explosives planted throughout the temple and under many of the seats they now occupied.
"You have all mocked me, called me a half-breed, and said I did not belong here,"
I shouted. Everyone turned to look at me. Some sneered in disgust. Others shook their heads in disbelief.
My mother is a true Jew from Israel. The blood of the ancient Hebrews runs through her veins, and thus mine, I began.
Sit down, Benji,
a man shouted.
Now is not the time for this,
a woman called out.
Now is the time, I yelled back. You call yourself Jews, but you're filled with racism and hate. You've made it clear my entire life that I am not welcome here because of my father's black blood. You are imposters, lost European pretenders, whose fragile egos can't survive without claiming superiority over everyone. I continued.
Go home, Benji.
You're making a fool of yourself,
a man shouted.
If I were your mother, I would be ashamed,
a woman added. Their responses angered me.
You have the nerve to deny how you've treated me, even sitting in this temple? I roared. May God burn you all in hell!
I pulled the detonator out of my pocket and held it up for them all to see.
What is that?
A man asked. People began to scramble, rushing to the doors.
The doors are chained!
A man shouted. I felt powerful watching them run and cower before me. I was no longer the half-breed son of a black man. I was the one holding their lives in my hands. I couldn't stop smiling. Was I evil? Why did I enjoy their fear and horrors so much?
Beg God for forgiveness, I shouted.
Time seemed to slow as I pulled the trigger on the detonator. I was committed now. If I let go of the trigger, they would all be dead. Their blood would stain my soul as I faced God in the afterlife. Strangely, I thought of the Israeli girl my mother wanted me to marry, of the kids we could have had, and the life we could have lived. I wondered how much better things would have been if I wasn't biracial, if I were fully Israeli like my mother. Was it her fault that I now stood here? That I was about to blow this temple to hell, along with the hundreds of fake Jews inside? She chose to lay with my black father. She chose to give birth to me. She didn't think about the life I would live, or how I would suffer. But then again, how could she have known? I couldn't help but cry as I thought about my life. "Forgive me, Mother," I whispered. I couldn't hear the screams around me, the shouts of people kicking at the chain doors, the mothers holding their children and singing songs to God. I didn't care to see the pain and fear in their eyes. I was as deaf and blind to them as they had been to me. I brought the trigger close to my chest, took a deep breath, and pulled it. For a moment there was dead silence. Time stood still. It seemed like the whole world was watching this unfold, waiting with bated breath for the explosion. The faces of the European Jews who hated me for existing were frozen in fear and rage. Then, like the cold hand of death, the silence was shattered by a massive explosion. The entire temple rocked, followed by more explosions. People screamed and died in front of me. Blood and debris fell from the temple ceiling like rain. I fell to my knees, cupping my ears. The explosions were deafening. I closed my eyes. Maybe I was wrong. All this death and destruction because they hated the black blood in me seemed excessive now. I couldn't watch as people died, their limbs missing, blood pouring from them. I didn't want to see the children dismembered and mangled by the bombs and the horror I had unleashed. "Take me now," I prayed, begging God to end me, to let one of the bombs hit me. I knew I couldn't live with all this death on my hands. Feeling rage and pain from being hurt by a community was normal and natural, but killing them all was demonic. Jesus was wrong. No man of God, no prophet would do such a thing. His pure heart could not endure the pain and suffering of others. My pain had made me a terrorist. If I didn't die here, my life was over either way.
"Please, God," I begged. As if answering my prayer, something hard struck my head. I smiled as I embraced the darkness. Maybe God did love me. Maybe He had forgiven me enough to take me from this world, to save me from the pain and consequences of what I had done. Jeshiem. "You're doing it wrong, Jeshiem. If you really want to cut, do it down your arm, not across." My mother's words echoed in my head. I couldn't get them out of my mind. How could she be so cold? Did she want me to hurt myself? Did she want me to die? "This way you bleed a lot more." I couldn't stop the tears from rolling down my cheeks. I tried all week to forget what she had said, but for some reason I couldn't shake it. I didn't know why this hurt so much. She told me my entire life how much she regretted having a black son, how she wished she could have aborted me. As much as that hurt, I could move on and focus on other things. I found myself back in my closet. It was peaceful here. My escape from my mother and the world that seemed to hate me for existing. I don't know why I fooled myself into thinking life would be different for me in America, that black Americans would accept me. I was as foreign to them as I was to the Arabs. I was just alone. I wondered if my father ever thought about me, if he ever considered how I would feel being created and left to rot in a world that hates half-breeds. How could they? They were so caught up in their lust that they never once thought that they were creating an abomination, a human cursed to be alone. Maybe my life would have been better if he was in my life. Maybe I would have had an anchor, some place where I could be accepted. Maybe if my mother loved me, the Arabs would have been more accepting of me. How could they respect me when my own mother didn't? How could they see me as a human being worthy of love when my mother saw me as a burden? My mother was right. I needed to cut properly so I could bleed more. I wanted to see every drop of my mixed blood fall from me. Maybe if I bled enough, I could claim the side that was left. I sighed deeply and held the blade I stole from the kitchen against my wrist. I cut deeply, just as my mother had instructed. I winced and cried in pain as the silver blade parted my light brown flesh. The pain was quickly replaced with relief as I watched the blood pour out. I quickly cut my other wrist before my hand shook too much. My heart pounded in my chest. My breathing came in quick, shallow bursts. I could feel myself being drained. I could feel myself dying. I looked around the cold, dark, dirty closet that would soon be my grave. I always thought I would be a hero, that I would have a grand funeral and people would mourn my passing. I never thought I would die alone, unloved and forgotten in a dirty closet. I couldn't help the tears that poured down my face. "Do you love me, Allah?" I whispered. Since no one else on this planet did, I wondered if the God of my mother's people did. How could he? If my mother, who prayed to him 5 times a day, hated me, how could the God she loved and followed care for me? The blood was thick, covering my legs like a red blanket. It was warm and inviting, luring me into a never-ending sleep. If Allah didn't love me, where would I go? Is there a spiritual afterlife for half-breeds? A place where we are all the same? I don't know why, but I felt sad for my mother. As I thought about a beautiful biracial heaven, the image of my mother crying entered my dying mind. This had to be some lie, some trick of my mind to make me feel loved as I died, to ease my passing from this world. The mother I had known my entire life hated my guts. She never missed an opportunity to let me know how much she truly resented me. I couldn't even sit at the same table as my siblings. They ate the best foods and sat comfortably in their chairs at the table. I had to sit on the floor like a dog, and they threw me scraps.
I either ate the scraps as they laughed at me, or I starved. Why would a woman who treated me like this care if I lived or died? Why would my siblings, who laughed and threw their half-eaten food on the floor for me, care? I came from this woman's womb, and she hated me. I couldn't hold back the deep sobs that seemed to come from my soul. There is no pain like being rejected by the womb that bore you. It's strange, but I could see her cursing me even before I was born. She would lie on the bed, rubbing her swollen belly, cursing me for existing inside her. She had hated me since I was conceived. Oh, how I wish she had aborted me. "I forgive you, Mother," I whispered. A shudder crept down my spine as I spoke those words. I felt free of my mother. For once in my life, I wasn't terrified of her shadow looming over me. I could sleep without the fear of her creeping into my room and punching me in the stomach like she did so often. I remember one night when I hid under my bed, my ribs hurt from the many nights before. She crept in as usual, hoping to punch me as hard as she could, but ended up punching the bed. I couldn't help but laugh as she stumbled back, surprised. She pulled me out from under the bed and beat me until I passed out. Strangely, seeing her surprised face that night was one of my best childhood memories with her. My whole body started to shake. I was getting close now. I wondered what awaited me. Would it be cold darkness? Or would I end up in some other world, born to new parents, with this old world and existence forgotten? Either one seemed like heaven compared to my current life.
"Jeshiem!"
I heard a voice call my name. I wasn't sure if this was real or something else. Was the angel of death calling for me? The closet door opened. The light that poured in stung my eyes. A face stared at me in silence for a moment. Then I heard a loud scream that made my heart pound. I didn't care who it was that found me. I was dying, and there was nothing they could do now to stop it. I was ridding myself of my mother, who wished I was dead anyway, and of my siblings, who thought of me as a half-black dog. Fuck them all. I felt arms around me.
"Jeshiem!"
I heard her voice pierce through the fog of death.
"Why is she here? Can't she let me die in peace? This is what she's always wanted from me anyway."
"Thank you, son," she said. I could feel her kissing my forehead. She wasn't trying to call 911. She wasn't trying to save me. She just held me in her pale arms and watched me as I was dying. I could see the joy in her brown eyes. I was giving her the greatest gift. I was ridding her of me.
"I forgive you, Umi,"
I whispered. This time, I wasn't saying it into the darkness. I was saying it directly to the woman who hated me, who had made my life a living hell, to the woman who had counted the days until I did something like this. Hell, she'd taught me how to cut properly. She shuddered and nodded as she stared at me. For once in my life, I saw something other than hate for me in her eyes. It wasn't love, but it wasn't hate either. I couldn't help but smile. She ran her fingers through my thick, curly hair. I wondered what she was thinking. But truly it didn't matter. I could feel death approaching. There was no grand light to guide me home. There was no stranger or loved one waiting for me. There was just darkness. To some, this darkness would be terrifying. But for me, it was inviting. It was quiet. It was like a cold blanket wrapping itself around me. Maybe I'd wake up on the other side of this darkness somewhere. I remembered reading in my mother's Quran that Allah said death was like waking up from a deep sleep. Maybe I was trapped in a nightmare.
Maybe everything I'd gone through and endured was not real, and I was about to wake up as a non-mixed boy somewhere. Wouldn't that be amazing? To wake from the nightmare of being biracial and be fully one race? To have a normal life? To have a father who loved me and took me outside to play catch? And a mother who baked apple pies and loved me? That would be heaven. "Call 911!" my mother shouted. She had to cover her tracks, to make it seem like she just found me here, and immediately called for help. I hoped I haunted her, that the memory of me lying in her arms, bleeding to death, kept her up at night, that she shuddered every time she thought of her half-breed baby boy dying. I'd forgiven her, but I knew that wherever I went, my soul would never forget. The bruise she left on my soul was like a stain that would carry on with me. Even if I were reborn and granted new flesh, my soul would still remember. Even if my new flesh was oblivious to what the soul had endured, I wondered if dreams were a way for our souls to try to make us remember parts of who we truly are, of the pain we have endured. My body started to shake uncontrollably. I could not stop it. Death was here. She had finally come for me. "It's time, beloved." I heard her whisper. This voice was not my mother's. It was sweet and dark. It smelled like rotten sugar, a mixture of a rose and decay. It was like smelling the last unspoiled part of an old apple pie. Somehow that smell was comforting. I held out my hand. I could no longer tell if my body was doing this or if it was my soul. I no longer had control. I smiled and felt something soft grab my hand. I was gently pulled from my body. I stood next to my mother and watched her weep as she held me, watched her stroke my curly hair and kiss my forehead. Strangely, I no longer cared. My old body was no longer my concern. The pain and emptiness that came with that body were gone. I was going somewhere else. Maybe I'd finally woken up from the nightmare. "Farewell, Jeshiem," I whispered. I stared at my body one last time. That poor boy who just wanted to be loved. I smiled at him. I loved him. I didn't know why I couldn't find this love for myself while I was in that body. I sighed and followed death to whatever awaited me. Hunxie. The portly and kind black woman studied Hunxie as she ate, her gaze lingering on the slight slant of Hunxie's big, dark eyes and the loose curls of her hair. "You're mixed, ain't you?" the woman asked. Hunxie sighed. She couldn't understand why everyone was so fascinated with mixed people. Wasn't it obvious that she was neither fully Chinese nor black? That she was something in between? She had a bit of her Chinese mother and some of her deadbeat black father. Hunxie's frustration was obvious. She nodded as she continued to eat. The older woman frowned. "I meant no offense, darling. You're beautiful. I was just trying to figure out how such beauty was created," she said with a smile. Hunxie paused between bites, feeling bad for being frustrated with this kind woman. "I knew a mixed boy once," the woman said, her eyes staring off into nothing, lost in a memory that seemed to pain her. "He had that same look of pain in his eyes." She reached forward and gently grabbed Hunxie's hand. "You ain't thinking of going to see sweet Jesus, are you?" the woman asked. It took Hunxie a moment to piece together what she meant. She couldn't deny that the thought had crossed her mind more than once. She felt like a stray dog that no one wanted, the ugly duckling from the old children's books, except that there was no growing up and becoming a swan at the end of her story. Hunxie didn't know how to answer. She had often wished she were dead. The old woman patted her hand. "I don't know why people mate outside their race.
It's always the babies of those unions that suffer, the woman said, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. The poor mixed boy I knew killed himself. I see that same lost look in your eyes. She picked up her plate, walked across the diner, and disappeared into the kitchen. Being mixed was a curse, like a ball of shit wrapped in a pretty package. The world saw only the package, oblivious to the pain and turmoil lurking within. Hunxie finished her food, grateful for the old woman's kindness. She knew she had to figure out her life. She had to find a place to sleep tonight. She thought about her mother. This would be the first day she could remember waking up without seeing her smiling face. Hunxie's shoulders slumped as she fought back a sob. "You okay, child?" the kind old woman asked. Hunxie quickly wiped her tears and nodded. "I miss my mother," Hunxie said quietly. The old woman sat back down across from her. "Why don't you go back home, love?" she suggested. Hunxie shook her head. "I can't," she replied. The old woman studied her, unsure whether to press the issue, but decided against it. "I need some help around here, if you're willing. These old big bones of mine can't run this place like they used to," the woman said, looking around and sighing. "This place used to be something, child. This place has history and soul. Whatever is ailing you, these old walls and my good cooking will help you heal it." Hunxie glanced around the diner, taking in the faded pictures on the walls, the worn-out seats, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from the old woman's presence. There was something comforting about the place, a quiet resilience that called out to her, offering a small flicker of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know," Hunxie muttered, pushing her plate away. She hadn't eaten this much in days, and the food sat heavy in her stomach. "I'm not good at much." The woman chuckled softly, a sound like rolling thunder on a warm summer night. "Oh, honey, you don't have to be good at anything to start. You just have to be willing. And maybe, just maybe, this place can give you something in return." Hunxie stared down at her hands, tracing the lines of her palms as if they held answers she'd been searching for. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. It was always the babies of those unions that suffered. But she didn't want to be a victim of her parents' choices any longer. She needed to find her own path, even if it was one she had to carve out of the mess that was her life. "What do you need help with?" Hunxie finally asked, her voice small and uncertain. The old woman's face lit up with a smile that reached her eyes. "Everything, darling. Cooking, cleaning, serving. This place is a labor of love. But it's hard for these old bones to keep up." Hunxie nodded slowly. She wasn't sure if she could commit to anything, not when she felt so lost and broken, but the offer felt like a lifeline, a tiny thread of connection in a world where she often felt invisible. "I can try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman reached across the table and squeezed Hunxie's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "That's all I ask, child. Just try. You might find that this place has a way of mending what's been broken." Hunxie nodded, a lump forming in her throat. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't feel so bleak. A future where she could find some peace, even if it was within the walls of a run-down diner owned by a kind stranger. "Thank you," Hunxie said, her voice cracking. She didn't know if this would be the answer, but it was a start. A small step towards something better, and for now that was enough. The old woman stood, her knees cracking as she did, but she kept her smile steady. "We'll take it one day at a time, sweet girl. You'll see, things can get better. Sometimes all it takes is a little faith and a good meal," she said.
The old woman pointed to a door that seemed to barely be on its hinges. The paint was cracked and fading. The knob was rusted. The door looked like it had not been touched in years.
"That's your room, darling," the old woman said.
Hunxie stared at the door, unsure of whether she would be better off sleeping in some ditch.
"It's not much, and it for sure needs some attention, but it has a warm bed, and it's yours if you want it," the old woman said.
Hunxie stood and walked over to the door, almost afraid to touch the knob. A soft glow emanated from under the door, warm and welcoming. She took a deep breath and opened it. The room was small but neatly kept. It wasn't the dingy nightmare she had pictured in her mind. The bed was small, with old covers, and there was an aged dresser covered in dust. The walls were bare, the paint peeling and cracked in places. The old woman was right. This room just needed some care. Hunxie smiled.
"Bathroom and shower upstairs," the old woman said, patting her on the shoulder.
The months passed slowly, each day blurring into the next, as Hunxie settled into her new life at the diner. The old woman had a gentle way of guiding her without pushing too hard. Together they cooked meals, scrubbed floors, and listened to the old radio that played soulful blues and gospel, filling the diner with a warmth that Hunxie hadn't realized she needed. The old woman never spoke much about her past, and Hunxie didn't pry. But she noticed how the old woman's hands trembled more often, and how she would sometimes clutch her chest, wincing when she thought no one was looking. Hunxie had asked her once if she was okay, but the old woman had just waved her off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the diner in a golden hue, the old woman pulled Hunxie aside. She looked more tired than usual, her once vibrant eyes now dull and clouded. Hunxie could feel the air grow heavy around them, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was to come.
"Hunxie, child," the old woman said, her voice rasping with each breath, "I need to tell you something important."
Hunxie nodded, her heart thudding in her chest as she sensed the gravity of the moment. The old woman reached into the pocket of her worn apron and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope, handing it to Hunxie with trembling fingers.
"I'm not going to be around much longer, sweet girl," the old woman said, her voice cracking. "Cancer's got me. Doctors say it's spread too far. Ain't much they can do now."
Hunxie felt the air leave her lungs. She tried to speak, but the words got caught in her throat, tangled up in a mix of sorrow and disbelief.
"I've had a good run," the old woman continued,
her smile sad and wistful.
"This diner, it's been my whole life. It's seen me through the best and worst of times. And now, I want it to be yours."
Hunxie stared at the envelope in her hands, the weight of the old woman's words pressing down on her.
"I don't know anything about running a diner. I can't—"
The old woman cut her off with a gentle squeeze of her arm.
"You don't have to know everything, Hunxie. You just have to keep this place going. Keep its heart beating. It's yours now. All of it."
Hunxie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She looked around the diner, at the faded pictures on the walls and the chipped tiles on the floor. She thought about all the quiet moments she'd spent here, finding solace in the clatter of dishes and the smell of the old woman's cooking. This place had become more than just a diner. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm that was her life.
"Why me?"
Hunxie asked, her voice barely a whisper. The old woman's smile was soft and knowing.
Because, child, you're more than what the world sees. You got a heart that's been hurt, but it's still beating. And that's enough. You're enough.
Hunxie nodded, her vision blurred by tears. She clutched the envelope to her chest, feeling the faint beat of her own heart, steady and strong. The old woman leaned back in her chair, her breath shallow, but her spirit still fierce.
Promise me, Hunxie. Promise me you'll keep this place alive.
Hunxie nodded again, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She wrapped her arms around the old woman, holding onto her tightly, as if she could keep her here just a little longer.
I promise, Hunxie whispered. I'll take care of it. I'll take care of you.
The old woman closed her eyes, a peaceful smile spreading across her face.
That's all I needed to hear, sweet girl. That's all I needed.
They sat there in silence, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the diner. Hunxie held the old woman's hand, feeling the frailty of her grip, the warmth slowly fading from her skin. She stayed with her until the last breath left the old woman's body, a quiet release that felt like the soft exhale of a life well lived. Hunxie wiped her tears, her heart aching with a profound sense of loss. But amid the grief, she felt a quiet determination, a resolve to honour the old woman's legacy. The diner was more than just a building. It was a testament to resilience, to love, to the beauty of small, everyday moments. Hunxie stood up, glancing around the diner with new eyes. This place was hers now. It was up to her to keep its heart beating, just as the old woman had asked. She walked to the front door and flipped the sign to closed, taking a moment to breathe in the stillness of the night. As she locked up, Hunxie felt the weight of the future ahead. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. With the envelope still clutched in her hand, Hunxie stepped out into the cool night air, the stars above her twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. She looked up, feeling a strange sense of comfort, as if the old woman were watching over her, guiding her every step of the way. Hunxie took a deep breath and whispered into the quiet night,
"Thank you. I won't let you down."
And as she walked away, she carried with her the memory of a kind old woman who had seen her worth when no one else had, who had given her a chance to start anew. Hunxie knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to try. One day at a time, just like the old woman had said, one day at a time. She decided to change the name of the diner to something more fitting, something that reminded her of who she was. She was biracial, a mix of her parents' worlds. It was the old woman who helped her come to terms with that. Hunxie smiled as she spoke the new name. Waffles and egg rolls. Benji. It hurt to breathe. I could feel the heat of fire all around me. Am I dead? Is this hell? If it was, I knew I deserved it. I didn't care much about the adults I'd killed, but the children were innocent. I had no doubt they would grow up to be just as racist and hateful as their parents. But they weren't that yet. They were just kids. I couldn't see. Was I blind? The darkness around me was so complete that this had to be death. I could hear screams and pleas as people burned alive. I could hear the prayers of women calling out to God to save them. What have I done? How could this be the will of God, this pain and suffering? I was no prophet, no chosen one. I was just a terrorist. "Oh, God!" I started. but dust and debris flooded my mouth as soon as I opened it. I started to cough. I wanted to scream from the pain. I had to be in hell. Jesus had fooled me. He was probably laughing at me right now, the idiot biracial boy he played like a fiddle. He played upon my hate and rage for being rejected. He played upon my need to be included. Now here I am in hell, while he is living and mocking me. I'd been so foolish. I wondered if my mother would visit my grave, if she would even acknowledge me. I wouldn't blame her if she disowned me. Who would want a terrorist as a son? I heard more screams. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. A fresh wave of pain shot through my body every time I tried. I could feel the fire getting closer. My heart raced in my aching chest. I didn't want the flames to touch me.
My baby! Yahweh, please save her!
I heard the cry of a mother. My heart felt like a knife was passing through it, like the devil stabbed me and then pulled the blade out slowly before ramming it back in. Her voice was so full of pain. Even here in hell with me, she prayed for her child. Would my mother pray for her terrorist son? I bet this grieving woman was willing to sign away her soul for the sake of the child that shared her womb. The fires were getting closer. I could feel the flames teasing my feet. I screamed in pain.
You hear that?
I heard someone say. I heard the heavy thudding of footsteps as something approached. I was in hell, wasn't I? I was dead. I was sure of it. I could hear them digging through the rock and rubble.
There's someone here!
I heard a man shout. A bright light pierced the darkness. My eyes teared up. There was someone in front of me, but my vision was too blurry to see clearly.
You're going to be okay, son,
the man's voice said. But would I? Did he know what I'd done? That the death and destruction around us was by my hand? Surely he didn't. If he did, he would leave me here in this hell. He would leave me to the flames and the wails of the damned. I deserved it. "Leave me!" I gasped. Each word erupted from my lips with blood. Pain coursed through me. I wanted to punch this man, to explain to him that I was evil, that I belonged here, that I wasn't worth saving. I felt rough hands on me, and I screamed in pain as they pulled me from the rubble.
I think this is him,
a man said. The man's fist landed hard on my face. I think he broke my nose. I couldn't feel the pain. I smiled and laughed as blood dripped from me. This is what I deserved. I think I was losing my mind. I couldn't stop laughing. The man hit me several more times. I'm certain he and the others would claim they found me this way, that my beaten and swollen face was part of my wounds from the bombing. I must have blacked out. I woke up in the hospital, handcuffed and shackled to the bed. My head hurt, and my entire body ached. What had they done to me? I could see, but my face was so swollen it was like peering through water. I was sure I looked like the demon I was. I felt a gentle hand on mine. "Benji?" I recognized the voice. It was my mother. For some reason, her voice broke me. The pain hit me hard as I cried. The tears stung the many wounds on my face. "Don't say anything to them, Benji. You have a lawyer. I got the best one in town," my mother said. I sighed, hearing the pain in her voice. Struggle as she tried to seem strong while looking at her son, mangled and barely alive. Knowing that if I did survive, I would rot in some cell somewhere, I was sure I'd probably receive several more beatings from law enforcement. For some reason, this country loved the white Jews. No matter how racist and vile they were, America and its Christians loved them. No matter how many children they slaughtered in Palestine, they were loved.
No matter how many pregnant Palestinian women they killed, and then made shirts saying, 1 shot, 2 kills, they were loved. No matter how many mass graves of the victims of their brutality and genocide, they were still loved. I, the half-black Jewish boy, didn't stand a chance. I had hit them in their heart, in the one place where they felt safe. I had done to them what they had done to me my entire life. But no one would care. No one would want to know my side of the story. They would play the victims while hiding their hands on the world stage, like they always did. I would probably get the death penalty. I would ask for it. There was no life for me anymore. I knew my mom didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't want her to waste her life savings over me. I deserved my fate. "No, lawyer," I gasped in pain. I could feel my mother staring at me. I was still a minor, so she had the right to be here. I was glad that my face was too swollen to see the pain and horror on hers. "Why, Benji?" my mother asked. Her voice cracked. I knew it must be killing her to hold in her pain. She was always my rock, my anchor that kept me from being lost in the ocean of hate. I wasn't sure if her question was about why I didn't want the lawyer, or why I did what I did. "Why did you make me, Mom?" I asked. I knew this wasn't fair to her. She had no idea that my black father would leave her. She had no clue what was in store for me or any other biracial child. "You cursed me to be biracial," I said between painful gasps. I could feel her hand shaking on mine. She knew that I struggled to fit in, that I had been bullied by the white Jewish community my entire life. I didn't blame her, but I wanted to hurt her so she would leave. I was no longer her little Benji. I never would be again. I didn't want her to see me this way. "Let me die, Mom," I pleaded. I could feel my mom's heart breaking. No matter what I did, she would never forget the days I kicked her in her womb, the tears she wept as she talked to me, and how her heart broke when my father left us. But she decided to be the best mom she could be to me. She had gone out of her way to let me know I was half black. She bought me movies and taught me black history. She even enrolled me in camps for black boys without fathers. I did not deserve this amazing woman. She had no clue those fatherless black boys would bully me for being a half-breed. Her heart was too kind to comprehend this. I never told her. I didn't want the guilt of it to plague her. But now, I needed this woman to let me go, to let me rot like I deserved. I never saw my mother again. She has tried to see me, but I've refused to see her. They tried me as an adult and sentenced me to death. I would be the youngest person in my state to receive the death penalty. I didn't turn on Jesus and his crew. They had released a manifesto that did me justice. They spoke about the racist bullying I had received at the hands of the white Jewish community, of my struggles of being biracial and not fitting in. They had leaked it with video of me preparing. They even had the moments before I pressed the detonator. From what I heard, everyone online was discussing me. Many sided with me. Biracials everywhere were finding the strength to stand up and tell their stories. I am to die today. I can die knowing my death had meaning, that it gave the normally voiceless biracial a voice. "You ready, Ben?" the guard said. This guard had been nice to me. He didn't beat me like the others. Even though I knew I was going to die, I didn't fight them back. I deserved the pain. I deserved the torture. I had murdered kids. Besides, the pain reminded me that I was not a demon, that there was some humanity left in me. I nodded and stood.
I took one last look at the cell that had housed me in my final days. It was cold and dark, but fitting for what I'd done. I wondered how many other men had stood here like me and took their last glimpses of their home. Oddly, it did not feel strange to think of this cell as home. The guard cuffed me and took me out of my cell. Several other guards stood around me.
"I'm going to look forward to seeing you die,"
one of the guards whispered in my ear. Another spat on my face. They knew I couldn't wipe it. My hands were cuffed behind my back. I had to just deal with it. I felt it slide down my cheek and drip on the floor. Did I blow up one of your family members? If so, I'll see them in hell soon, I told the guard. He pulled out his baton and was preparing to strike me. I laughed at him. "I'm walking to my death, you fucking racist buffoon. There's nothing you can do to hurt me," I said. I locked eyes with the guard. I felt something in him recoil. Maybe I was a demon after all. Or maybe it was the cold certainty of knowing I only had a few moments left of life. I might as well already be a corpse. The guard hesitated and put his baton away. "There's something not quite right about this boy," the guard mumbled and got back in formation. I couldn't help but laugh as they walked me to the execution room. I couldn't stop laughing even if I tried. A guard pounded on the door to my execution chamber. It took a moment, but the door opened. I was walked into a white room. There was a hospital bed with straps on it. I couldn't help the shiver that went down my spine. I would die right there. I wondered how many people knew the exact spot and the way they would die. The guards uncuffed me and put me on the bed. My heart raced as they strapped me in. There was a huge window in front of me. I knew members of the media and my victims' families were there. I could see the grim looks on their faces. Watching me die seemed equivalent to watching Hitler die. These dumb Jews wanted to be the victims so badly that they really thought I attacked them simply because they were playing at being Jewish. I am a Jew. My mother is a Jew. I attacked them for their racism and hate, for bullying me, for being biracial my entire life. The nurse's hand trembled as she stuck the needle in my arm and primed the machine. I would have picked the firing squad, but the state didn't want to give me a choice in how I wanted to die. I guess they felt like I didn't deserve that. A death was a death to me. "Do you have any last words?" a guard asked. I nodded. "Biracials are people too. Their lives matter. They are not some abomination. They were created out of your love for someone of a different race. Don't treat us like monsters. Don't hate us for being born mixed. We never asked for this. If you all don't change, there will be more of me. Instead of it being Jews, it may be a black church or a white school. I am the product of your hate. Your loved ones died because of your ignorance and hate." I paused for a moment. "Today I will die because of your bigotry," I said. I nodded at the guard. He nodded at the nurse, and she pressed a button on the machine that held the liquids that would kill me. "I am biracial," I said. I could feel the first fluids enter my veins. I closed my eyes and thought of that beautiful Israeli girl. I thought of her smile, the way she made me feel when she smiled. "That's okay," I whispered. My veins felt hot, like they were on fire, but I did not open my eyes. I did not want to let go of her beautiful face. I couldn't help the tears that streamed down my cheeks. I knew I could have made her happy. Maybe in the next life. It was hard to breathe.
My heart felt like it was going to explode. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. "I would have made her happy," I said with my last breath, and smiled. Author's thoughts on Jeshiem. Jeshiem's story was based on my life. I thought it would be easier to write, since I had already lived it, but it was the toughest storyline out of the 3 in this book. Even though Jeshiem's life was based on mine, the way it ended was something I always thought about. I'd often sat in my mother's old, dirty closet and cut my arm, but I could never cut it the way my mother had taught me. Because of that, she hated me more. Not only was I the black son she never wanted, but I was also now a coward. I've never truly healed from my mother. I thought after she died I could finally be free of her. She, the monster under my bed, was gone, and I could finally put my feet on the floor without the fear of her reaching out from the darkness and grabbing them. But even after her death, the fear and terror she wrought on my life still lingers. Even being a 40-year-old man with a wife and a family of my own, I still fear the memory of the monster that used to lurk under my bed. Sometimes I wish I had the courage to end my life the way Jeshiem did, to end the fear and trauma of not only my mother, but of never being enough for anyone. The only comfort I've found in my life is with my beloved wife. Her love has been unconditional, a hand in the darkness that guides me home through my trauma and pain. I also find comfort in my children, who see me as a hero. I'm not just some old biracial guy who wasn't enough for them. I am their world. I'm their father, and no matter how I look or how mixed I am, I will always be enough for them. I know there are so many biracial men and women who feel like Jeshiem did, like I did, who wish they could find the strength to just end the curse of being mixed. I truly hope his story helped them in some way. Author's thoughts on Hunxie. I was lost when writing Hunxie. I didn't want her character to be all doom and gloom like the other 2. I wanted her to be redeemed, to find some happiness in her life. I wanted her to be the solitary rose that grew in the cracks of the concrete, the one that found her way despite the pain. Hunxie is a good person. She just wanted to exist without the hate that came with being mixed. She wanted to love as deeply as her Chinese mother and have the soul of the black American roots of her father. But it seemed both sides of her DNA wanted to deny that. I had to make her reach out to her father. She had to see for herself how he'd forgotten her, how he had moved on. I felt this was a pivotal point in her story. She had to be the hero and walk away from a place that had been both her home and her prison in order to save her mother. Her first thought was to call her father, a man she had never met. But like most of us who only dream of meeting the man whose blood runs through our veins, we are sadly disappointed. The illusion that maybe he had other things going on in his life that kept him from us shattered. Hunxie had to see that her father just didn't care. When he left her mother, he also left her. Hunxie is a made-up character. She's not based on anyone. I wanted her to be redeemed. My foster mother pointed out that my books tend to be sad and lack happy endings. Maybe that's my depression or the scars that still linger on my soul from the pain of my life. I'm just not a happy person. As I said earlier, this was the hardest storyline for me to write simply because it had a somewhat happy ending. So if this storyline seems a bit off, it's because of that reason. I didn't name the old black woman who showed Hunxie love and care, the woman that took her in. I didn't want the reader to get too attached to her, nor did I want to write her backstory. She was created to die, so to speak. Hunxie inherited that kind woman's restaurant
and blended the soul food cooking of her black side, which she learned from that kind old woman, with the Chinese cuisine of her mother's side. Egg rolls and waffles was a fitting name. It seems strange from the outside looking in, but once you go inside and see how the food complements each other, you may find that you love the strange and different. We biracials are exactly like that name. Strange at first, but once you take a closer look, we are a perfect blend of both of our cultures. Author's thoughts on Benji. Benji was an emotional roller coaster for me. I cried with him as he died. I felt his anger as he stood before the people who had been tormenting him for being mixed his entire life. I felt his hope when he met Jesus. For some strange reason, I really connected with Benji. Benji was a last-minute character that I put together when I decided to continue writing this book. I started this book over a year ago, but I ended up putting it on the back burner. Writing these stories is emotionally draining. Benji was not anti-Jew, and I don't want this book or his character to be framed that way. He attacked those who had been racially oppressing him his entire life. He ran into a charismatic black man who made him feel welcome in the black community for once in his life. That black man manipulated his pain of being rejected and focused it only on the white Jews who had been blatant about their disdain for his black blood. I liken Benji to the school shooter who was constantly bullied at school until one day he has had enough and steals a gun. What Benji did was an act of terror, and it was wrong. I'm not advocating for that at all. I wanted to portray the extremes someone can resort to when they are constantly bullied and oppressed. In my view, Benji was as much of a victim as he was a terrorist. There are causes and effects for all things. His white Jewish community hated him for being half black. They called him racial slurs and attacked him. No matter which adult he told, they wrote it off because they either did not believe that he was a victim of racist attacks, or felt he deserved it because they were racist themselves. Their hate and bigotry were the cause. And because of that, Benji took the only action that he felt he had left. I want to reiterate that this was the only option he felt he had left. Benji is far from a saint. He is also not a demon or an evil person. He was a boy abandoned by his black father and raised by his Jewish mother in a society and culture that is anti-black. His actions were the unfortunate result of that. Epilogue. I wanted to make this book different from the first book in the series. Book 1 talked about the discrimination that biracials endure from the black community. The black community seems offended by our very existence, which is strange since we didn't ask to be born. They are often more offended by us than by the black men and women who create us. The reality of the biracial experience is that we get it from both sides. In this book, I wanted to show that. We often find ourselves being not black enough for the black community, but too black to fit into any other community. This is where the identity crisis hits most of us. In our homes and from the rest of the non-black world, we are told we are black. Our non-black mothers will only see us as black. This is disheartening because she carried us in her womb for 9 months. She gave birth to us. But the racial hate and purity standards are so ingrained that she can't see us as her race. She will never identify her biracial child with herself. We will always be her black child. This distinction, this forced identity, carries with us. Then we get around other black men and women, and they let us know that we are not black enough. Only they are black enough to be the victims of America. Despite biracials having similar issues with racism, we are mocked, and our experiences are discredited by the black community simply because we have a non-black parent. The colorism and racism run deep on both ends of the spectrum. We, the offspring, are caught in the middle. A lot of people ask me why I write these books. Some in the black community accuse me of hating my black side or wanting to be white. Those questions and accusations are exactly why these books are needed. Biracials don't have a voice in the communities they are raised in. They are shamed into silence. Often the biracial is so afraid of being rejected by that community that they keep their mouth shut, despite the hate and racism they endure from the black community. The fact is, we are not black people. We are also not our other race. We are a mixture of both. We have to find a way to be okay with that. Our healing starts there. Starts with accepting who and what we are and being okay with it. This is why I write these books. It's okay to be biracial. It's okay to want our own racial designation so we can form our own communities around it. We are tired of being forced onto the black community and dealing with the hate and racism that comes with that. We have our own struggles with identity and race, and oftentimes our oppressors are not the same as those of black people. Our oppressors are the black community as a whole. Through these stories, I hope to give a voice to the biracial experience, to shine a light on the unique struggles we face, and to advocate for the space and respect that we deserve. We are not an afterthought or an anomaly. We are people with our own identities and experiences, and it's time the world recognizes that. This has been You're Not Black Enough, a biracial story. The Biracial Chronicles, Book 2. Written by Jessie Macbeth. Narrated by Andy Robert. Copyright 2024 by Jessie A. Macbeth. Production copyright by Jessie A. Macbeth.